Right, this is going to be another episode of Thorinquiry, my interview series here on my side channel. And my guest for this episode is going to be Phoenician Hunter, who is an author and an online thinker, personality, who I think... It's funny, it's hard to describe because I feel like actually that's a decent description. You're kind of just a thinker. You're someone who has like a perspective on the world. And as we'll get into in this episode, I was initially just interested in one specific area about language and things like that. But I actually found in reading some of your work in that sense, you actually have a very sort of broad perspective on, I would say, everything: reality, history, language, politics. Like, how do you think of yourself in terms of how you want to present yourself, your persona in the online space? How would you describe yourself in that sense? I don't mean that, by the way, as a rule as an interviewer. As a quick aside for beginner interviewers, never ask someone to describe themselves in the sense of like, who are you? I more mean, how do you want to see yourself? How do you want to be thought of as a specific type of thinker? Are you a conspiracy researcher? Are you a historian? What do you think of yourself as?
Okay, thank you for having me, first of all.
Oh, thanks. No.
Yeah, I like to think of myself as a thinker, I guess, and a researcher, and I'm into, history, obviously, because it's all connected. I originally started out as sort of looking into language, and it sort of grew from there, I guess. Yeah.
Okay. I mean, that's a perfect place to start because I'll actually just set up essentially this episode by describing how I discovered your content. So first of all, I'm one of these people. I only ever used to use Twitter/X just for my work, which is a very niche online competitive video game space where if you're not really into that, I mean, I am just a guy just endlessly going about that. Like if people don't know that space, think of something like people who are into chess or actually even some things I am into like battle rap or whatever. It's obviously super niche. And if you go into that area, the people are mega nerdy about that. So, but over the years, one thing I realized very quickly was Twitter's not actually that good a medium for talking with just random people, because guess what? Random people are really rude and they don't really care to follow your thoughts or have good faith conversations, So what I found over the years was I tend to mainly just use social media. For me, it's sort of like a one-way street. I just publish my thoughts and my content. So what I actually had to learn was, in order to enjoy the social component, I actually had to go outside of my space of esports. And what I did was I started to follow all these people who were just, some of them are in the political space, probably people you also follow. Some of them were just, just general people. I just made my algorithm to what I'm interested in. And in doing so, you're one of the people I discovered. And actually, it was your book initially that I was interested in, because the title of this book, The Secret World of Words, immediately, mate, the title's a banger already. You've got me immediately. Because one thing I'm really into is, I'm really into like conspiracy ideas and the occult, especially things like magic, which are obviously all tied into the ideas of language and how it programs our minds. And so already I could tell you were hinting at something there. Although here's what's funny. I'll give you a compliment and an interesting framing to start the convo, which is initially I actually hoped this book was going to be what it isn't. I hoped this book, because the subtitle's a banger, mate. It says how the English language is used to control and manipulate you. I actually initially really hoped this was going to be an absurdly niche book that was going to go like super deep into all sorts of arcane topics, like about how John Dee in the British Empire was using angel language to, like reprogram the mind of man to think of the British. I thought it was going to go that angle, right? Whereas what I would actually say as a compliment is it doesn't. It's almost the opposite. What I would say the beauty of this book is, I think it's almost like the ultimate primer, not even just for the notion of things like alternate history or conspiracy, but almost just an alternate way of seeing the world, or in this case, I would say with the theme of the book, a more accurate way of seeing the world. So you don't sort of like, I would give the example, normal people can't see the wood for the trees, as the old saying goes in English. They're too stuck on the details and the minutiae and thinking that everything's disconnected and what's in a name and all that jazz. Whereas I actually think one thing this book does an amazing job of, by the way, I will say it's not a super in-depth book. That's the secret. Like, for me, it's like the best PowerPoint presentation I've ever seen on the idea of maybe reality isn't what you think it is if you're just a turbo normie. What do you think of that as a starting point?
Well, exactly. I want to, the purpose of this book was to keep it simple. And I was actually aiming for it. I was aiming for normies, people who aren't typically into conspiracy theories, and that's why I didn't, delve deeper into that in that aspect of it, or the occult. Or, even though I had studied that myself, I didn't want to present that because you don't need it. You don't need it to understand, like, the basics. You've read my book. and it's very basic. It's easy to follow, and it's all done, purposely. I've extended, if you want to look deeper into, the occult or who's behind the scenes, I've done that with my Substack. That was the purpose of my Substack.
Right.
And it's interesting you bring up John Dee, because I've actually written, an article about him, and he is actually part of this whole, manipulation of the language, because he was part of this merchant guild, which is called the Merciers Livery Company of the City of London. And they were behind the manipulation of the English language. So there's a little connection there for you.
Yeah, by the way, I would also say, first of all, I actually think, also this is a perfect word to use it if people know the theme of the book, it's a very fluid read. I actually find it flows really well, Phoenician Hunter. Like, one thing, like I said, that's why I said it's like the ultimate PowerPoint presentation. One thing I think you did an amazing job with, and I've never seen anyone do this in the conspiracy world, mate, is normally the actual downside of conspiracy thinking is, if you even think about almost the way someone tells you about a conspiracy, they don't do it in a calm, slow manner where they give you a few breadcrumbs. It's always that listen, you've got to listen to me. Like, this is true. You've got to believe. And that tone alone puts people off, but also it means that people tend to go way too much into information dumps and putting way too much info out there. And one of the biggest problems I find that you experience in this world is, I love that saying. I forget how it's exactly phrased, but it's something like you have to hear an idea a million times before it actually registers. It's almost the idea that the 1,000,001st time, it's the same idea, but it hits you differently, and suddenly it just opens a lock with the key, as it were. And so one of the problems I think that people have is, I think it's actually way better to do the method you've done, because I would say the brilliance of this method is, have you ever heard of Hemingway's iceberg theory? Have you ever heard of that?
No.
Right, it's a very simple concept. Basically, the author Ernest Hemingway had an idea that, like an iceberg, where the majority of it's actually below water, and it's the part we see above. It's the idea that when you write something, you don't present the whole iceberg. It's, if you're really skillful as an author, you can present essentially just the little bit that pokes up at the top, and the rest can almost be inferred from the way that you chose the essence of this story or what it hints at. I would say your book is a great example of that, mate. I actually feel like almost every page, first of all, one thing that's great is a book that asks more questions than it actually gives answers. But I think probably the best part is, in theory, every single point or page could actually lead someone, like I say, in a different direction of research. It goes sort of it's almost like an arrow to a rabbit hole, as it were, which, as you say, you're obviously exploring those individual rabbit holes on the Substack, right?
Yeah, exactly. And there are a few themes in the book that I didn't want to give too much informational data on, because, it just, otherwise, when are you going to stop? This book will be too long and too big. So I just, like you said, hinted at the idea. And then if you were interested in that, then you could take it further and look into those subjects, yourself. Another thing I wanted to point out is, what I found with conspiracy theories, a lot of people were advocating for, interference or, the involvement of aliens or reptilians or archons, and Satanists were behind everything, Lucifer. And to me, I just didn't buy into that. I just felt that was an excuse. It's like when people they can't understand how the pyramids are made, so they automatically veer off to it's aliens.
Right.
It's the same with the occult. And I wanted to stay grounded and say, no, there's more to it than this. There's got to be some kind of human involvement. And what I found was, the best way to describe it is like the wizard from The Wizard of Oz. He's this little weak, pathetic man, but because he understands how to use that machine, the illusions, he's able to, exert his power over everyone. It works exactly the same way. That's what I found anyway.
Sure. I mean, one thing I actually found interesting I wanted to ask you about was, I actually do find that, what's funny is I heard, listen to one of your podcasts that you do with that guy, what's his name? Lumina. Lumina. And this, I saw when you were talking about this topic on that podcast that you were basically mentioning, I forget where I was going with that, but basically the gist is, that's it. He mentioned himself that he'd seen a bunch of these little like details, almost like individual pages of your book. And I would say a similar thing to you, actually. I would echo the sentiment. Because obviously you're inspired by people like Jordan Maxwell. I've heard some of the sort of like, it's like a maritime theme to everything. I've heard a lot of these like bits in isolation, but I've never seen someone put it all together. And that's the key part. Because when I say that thing before, you can hear something a million times, but it won't register. It won't essentially have significance. It won't have meaning. I think one of the biggest problems with all conspiracy areas, mate, is people who go down those rabbit holes are really bad at actually retracing their steps out of the rabbit hole and then showing you how to get to where they went to. They tend to just sort of be like, hey, just dive right into the deepest point with me right now. But because you don't have the framework to get there, or even, I would say the key thing in your case is the mental model. I think that's what you do a very good job, building up a mental model of how the world could be different than we see it as and how things connect. I think that's actually a really important detail because, to give you a random aside, if people look into things like astrology, or a classic one, probably the most classic one for the conspiracy world that I think puts people off is when people do gematria. So essentially like a Kabbalistic way of like looking at the way words and numbers connect.
I can't do the numbers.
No, I know. This is exactly what I'm talking about, mate. The real problem is this. I will say that's one of those topics which when I initially looked into it looks like absolute gobbledygook. It looks like, it's just a bunch of nonsense where it's just a grab bag for people to, connect things that aren't connected. But I will say there is, like everything, there's a lot of signal noise, but there is something to it. It's just the problem is, though, you will be so put off by the person who does a half-assed job of attempting to convince you of that or apply it to you and show you how, this number connects to this. The person who does a bad job does a way worse job. And he doesn't realise he puts you off that forever. He makes you think it's silly or there's nothing there. And I would say this actually, I think, applies to the broader topic, right? It's actually why I thought one thing that was also quite good about how you did your book is you don't try to bash people over the head. Almost everything's almost phrased as a question, I notice.
Yeah, that's done on purpose. I want people to think, think logically as well, and don't just believe. This is our problem in society.
Right.
It's built on myth, on beliefs. And it's not built on first-hand experience, and I find that is a problem, and that's where we get these ridiculous, theories that come from that. And it's interesting you mentioned Jordan Maxwell because I was inspired from him early on, but if you listen to him, he doesn't actually provide any sources to what he just makes these claims and that's it, and he leaves it.
Yes,
and then it's up to you to go and, research further. But what I found with a lot of his stuff is I was able to find sources to what he was saying, but he doesn't provide them. He wants you to go out and do that. And maritime law, in my Substack articles, I've really delved into that topic quite extensively. And I think I've been able to put that together better than most people. And, I've listened to a lot of people talk about it, but they don't give you the details and they don't give you the reason for it as well. Like who's behind it and why they did it or why they're doing it. And there is a spiritual connection to all this as well. There is, I believe the people who are behind the manipulation of language and the way I view language is just like a program. It's there to program your thoughts and ideas and in order to create an environment. And this environment benefits the people who are programming you, obviously, So I don't know if you find this, but I find that, your personal environment is a reflection of your thoughts and your ideas, right? So if you extend that to the world, you need a lot of people, running this same kind of program. And again, this is one of the reasons I wrote the book initially was because when I looked at the world, I view it almost like a commercial enterprise. It's everything has to do with commerce and materialism and consumerism. So I thought, okay, so who would that benefit above all? And that would benefit bankers or merchants.
Sure.
Right. So then that's what I found, who were behind the manipulation of the language were merchants. And, again, I covered that in my Substack.
Yes.
And so where was I going now? With maritime law, again, it's merchants doing that because what they've done is they've turned people into a ship or a vessel of commerce. And the world is almost like an invisible sea of commerce. And they've applied this maritime law, which originally only applied to ships on the sea. What they've done is they've converted people into ships, in a manner of speaking. So they've overlaid this law onto us. So yeah, that's what they've done with their spells.
I mean, by the way, one area I can spin this off is that's a perfect actual framing of why this particular topic, I think, always went over my head when I saw it normally.
Yep.
Like, first of all, I did appreciate when I've seen in the work of Jordan Maxwell and others, it's actually often Americans I notice to do this because they're all into that, like, we are free and the Constitution.
Yeah, sure they are.
That's just a classic American thing. We all know their chauvinism in that sense, but it's all good, right? When he does that, the problem is I notice it always tended to be connected with ideas that don't have to be connected, like being a free man and, becoming a sovereign citizen and stuff. And the problem with that, again, is that's not appealing to normal people. So as soon as you start going on about that, they're going to think like, this sounds weird, or it sounds a bit too out there, Whereas one thing I noticed that was interesting about the way you were building this up is essentially what you have to think of it as is, imagine if we were playing a game of chess, but you know the rules of chess and I don't. The odds of me winning are incredibly low, no matter how brilliant a person I am. And in this particular sense, I actually think the like sovereign citizen thing's almost like a side track thing. One thing I think is more interesting, and by the way, I actually might touch on the spiritual side in a minute, but I want to ask this. When I look at the way that like law, and especially things like maritime law, and as you say, these have been expanded to basically the entire Anglosphere and most of the world with how just the standards people operate on. One of the interesting things is there's almost a detail built into it that implies to me this isn't completely constructed by like evil humans to trap you only. And the reason I say that, mate, is because one thing I notice is if you actually follow the rules, you can use the rules and they can actually work in your benefit. Even though if you were building a system to just be like authoritarian, you wouldn't do that, You'd make it where like you lose all the time, and no matter what move you do, you lose in this equivalent analogy of a game. Whereas I've noticed it sounds like, much like with language itself, how you'll start to see through a lot of the illusions. It sounds like this is there's almost like a fair play built into the game, which is why I see why you may be hinting at something spiritual. Do you know what I mean?
Yep, exactly. I mean, I've heard bankers come out with quotes that they believe they are doing God's work.
Oh, right.
Okay. Now, this drives Christians crazy because they view them as, evil Satanists, like I said. But the way to think about it is like they're your father, for instance, and, or, I don't know if you're a father or a parent, but I am. And if you gave your child everything they wanted, is that being a good parent? So the way I view it, and I think this is the way the system is set up, if they just give you everything without you fighting for it or earning it or what kind of society will we have? What they're trying to teach us a lesson. One of those lessons is don't consume your mind with materialism. Okay, and I believe the Bible's written in similar fashion. Yes. For instance, the story of Jesus throwing the money changers out of the temple. Okay, and I've put this in the book, if you recall, where the temples are between the two. Your mind. They're talking about your mind, the temples, right? And what Jesus is saying is, clear your temple, your mind, of materialism, of wealth, of money. Okay? That's the way people need to approach the Bible as well. It's all metaphors and allegories. Yes. It's not literal. That's the problem with, that's my problem with religion, with the way most people approach it. They are trying to tell you something, and they are trying to tell you something good, but it's just how, your interpretation of it.
No, I know exactly what you mean. Like, put it this way, I would say, I think the father analogy is an excellent one because obviously, first of all, it's useful because it makes people realize, like, whatever evil people have control of the world, they aren't actually like unbeatable and perfect in the same way as your father isn't really all-knowing. He's struggling with his own decision of how much freedom does he give, how much does he punish it, how much does he need to inspire you, how much does he need to praise you. And one of the aspects I find very interesting about this that I feel like does tie into the legal system and even the way language is used is I notice a key concept here, which is very easy to, as you say, in like mythology or religion, to just tie into actual classic mythology, which is the idea that a lot of the system seems to be operating on the idea of consent. It's the idea that you have to even if essentially, even the evil that is done by these systems in the world, look, they can trick you with maybe like making a word seem the opposite of what it is, but you at the end have to sort of agree to do that thing or to be part of that thing. You can even tie this into the idea of Adam and Eve at the beginning, or I mean, and I would say as well, like I do notice one of those classic lines conspiracy people say is true. For some reason, these people within their system have to somehow show you and tell you what they're doing. It's just that their loophole is they'll make you think a word, like I say, means the inverse of what it means, so you won't really know what they're doing. But essentially, if you sort of had their dictionary, they are just telling you straight up, here's what I'm going to do to you, here's what's going to happen if you say yes, here's what you're agreeing to, here's how you're giving me power. Yeah. Like that's why I say this does hint. It's one thing I want to get into, because I'm not sure work doesn't go hard on this deal. I wondered how does this tie into a spiritual side to you, because it feels like that is, I mean, that's almost like people's religious framework for God is the idea that he allows free will, right? And it's our own choices that doom or make us succeed, right?
Exactly. And going back to what you said, I noticed during COVID with the vaccinations, you know, they didn't. No one held you down and forced an injection into you, right? Like you said, it's consent. Okay, so what were you? They were asking, what are you prepared to give up? And people weren't prepared to give up what? Their work, their income, their lifestyle.
Yes. Even going to restaurants and silly things like that. Yeah, exactly.
Exactly. Go to restaurants. You know, I didn't take the vax. There's no way I was going to. I knew it was a test early on. And actually, I knew something like that was going to happen. You can probably tell from my accent that I grew up in Australia, but I know I currently live in Italy.
Right.
I knew something was happening, and I knew something was going to happen. So I left Australia, you know, a year before COVID. Because
I'm sure you've heard this before, mate, but people actually do say in the conspiracy world that in the Anglosphere, the British Empire, for example, almost uses like Australia and New Zealand as like the test ground for that. It does seem like that, mate. That's why that was the first thing I was thinking during COVID when all that stuff like Djokovic was going on and stuff. I was thinking, this is too on the nose, mate. This is what people said.
Yep. No, I know. But it's like you said, it's in the language, and they tell you what's gonna manifest. So if you pay attention to the language, like I was at the time, I could see, we've got to get out of here.
Right.
I was saying to my wife, we need to leave. This is not going to be a good place to be. So, you know, that's why I left. And and that's what transpired. Now, when you're talking about a spiritual aspect to this, what I believe's happened is the system that we're under was put into place by the Roman Empire, okay? Something happened globally, which the best way to put it, there was a catastrophe, okay? That collapsed civilization as we knew it at the time, which was the Roman Empire. Now, they decided to rebuild civilization, and what they did is they took ownership of everything in order to do this, okay? Because somebody needs to take charge of what's, you know, of rebuilding. And I'm not just talking about, you know, building homes, I'm talking about, you know, rebuilding the language, rebuilding law, the systems, you know, commerce, everything that comes out of that. So they're the civilization builders, okay?
Yeah.
So they took responsibility for it. So if they took responsibility for it, they took ownership of it, okay? Now, the way I understand this system that we're under, the maritime law, and it goes into the birth certificate and all this.
Yes.
You use the birth certificate, so you can use it, but you don't own it, okay? So you don't own the name that is attached to this birth certificate, so the name you use every day. So, for instance, if you were taken to court for something, and the first thing the judge will ask you is, what is your name? As soon as you say, yeah, my name is whatever is on the birth certificate, you've brought in a controversy to the court, okay? Now, because what you've done is you've claimed that you're that name. Now, that name is already claimed by someone else, right?
Right.
So you've made a counterclaim, so you brought controversy into the court. What you need to do is say you're using it. And that's just like everything in the world. You don't own anything. This is what they're trying to teach you, okay? And this is why they're pushing this whole agenda. You'll own nothing,
Oh, and be happy. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, and be happy.
Yes.
That's actually how it works, because when you're not going to take your stuff with you when you die. So really, all you are doing is using it.
Yes.
They're trying to teach us that. They're trying to show you that just be happy with using it. Now, what they're doing is they're almost like guardians, and they're keeping it for future generations. So, they're keeping all this stuff going, for future generations. So that's why they're the guardians in some form.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So that's where the spiritual side of it comes into it. I really believe they're trying to teach us something, but people always look at it from, oh no, they're evil. They're trying to control me. They're trying to take away my things. And people get really upset with my point of view on that. But
I think I've got a good angle for you for that, actually, Mix. I think we're in a similar position, which is there's a recent show. I know, by the way, you actually are one of those people. I agree with the advice in general. Like, if you do fill your mind with just like silly fiction and stuff, that in itself will absolutely program who you are. But anyway, I'll give a pop culture reference just so people can sort of follow us. At the moment, a show that was quite, I think I had like critical acclaim, was this one that Apple TV made called Silo, which features that woman, Rebecca Ferguson, if you want, the one who's from Dune, and she was in like a Mission Impossible film years ago or something. And basically, the basic premise of this show is it's sort of like a post-apocalyptic type world where humans, initially you're just in this one silo that humans live in with like 10,000 people, and it's underground. And the idea is humans just live in this silo and they can't go out because, you don't know what it is initially. Is it a bomb's gone off or nuke or something? Is there a virus? You don't know what they're implying. Essentially, the whole first season is just about the idea you have to stay in this silo and no one knows what's going on outside and nobody knows who built it or when it all started, and people have sort of like a limited history as to what's going on. And one of the most interesting details, these are all spoilers, but don't worry about it, is basically in the second season, one of the interesting plot points is the first season is just the idea of, can someone go out of this silo? And they tell you if you go out, fully enough, this even sounds like some Garden of Eden shit a bit. They tell you if you go outside the silo, you just die, basically. Like, the world out there is not safe. You should stay in here where it's safe. And then they have sort of an authoritarian government inside the silo that runs everything, and with the sheriff and, a judge and people like that. Similar concepts to our society. It's clearly a metaphor. And one of the most interesting details, mate, is in the second season. So the first season's a classic story of like, I'm the individual. I'm trying to escape from this authoritarian regime. They're lying to me, obviously, because they're all liars, right? They're all evil. So they're telling me the outside's dangerous. Obviously, the outside isn't dangerous, and if I go out there, it'll all be okay. And here's what's cool, is essentially the cliffhanger at the end of the first season is when the main character does leave, it's essentially not one or the other. It's not that when she goes outside, it turns out that actually everything's awesome and that was the conspiracy, which is what they were trying to hint at in the first season, by the way. The idea that like, the government just lies to you and they're just trying to control you for like, their own ends. What they actually try to show you is the idea it's both. It's like, on the one hand, they are like limiting what you know and controlling you and telling you not to go out. But when she goes out, it turns out it actually is poisonous out there and it is really dangerous. And there's other silos. And in some of the other silos, when people actually rebelled and all went out en masse, they all died. And so one of the most interesting details, which I feel like is right on the money of what you're talking about, is the idea that the actual person running the first silo that you're following in this first season, it's actually not that they're just pure evil. They actually think that they're the caring father, basically, and that actually if you allow like the masses and the mob, for example, to just run wild, there will just be lawlessness and chaos, and it'll actually be the worst world possible, and people will all die and be killed, etc. And it gets to this sort of interesting kernel that you're addressing here of the idea that like, essentially, everyone can't be totally 100% free and make all the rules up. There is some degree to which you need like cohesion and consensus and protocols and just like you say with the analogy of the father, you wouldn't, when people say tell your kids the truth, yeah, but you select about what you tell them. You don't tell them when they're 3 that paedophiles exist and they're going to hunt them down or whatever. Like that information is not only of no use. It would terrify me. That would be more damaging for them to know that in a weird way, even though no one in the conspiracy world wants to hear this. You actually want to give them a little bit of innocence, a little bit of a bobble sometimes, and you almost want to be like we're talking about in this discussion, like once you show me that you're growing up and maturing, then I'll start to like drip feed you this stuff, and then we'll go in stages. Like, I feel like you're getting to something quite interesting here, because almost everything that is based around conspiracy thinking only ever comes down to 2 angles, and they're both too reductive, mate. It's always either just it's only about money, which I always say is a self-report that you're a pleb who only knows that money exists in the world. You don't know the deeper things. Or the other angle is they're just evil and they're just trying to control us. But as I say, I know what you mean. To me, it's more like, because essentially, I'll give the last angle, which is this. To me, I don't see how we would arrive where we are in the world today if the world really was just thousands of years of an insanely authoritarian system that had all the weapons of the god. Like you wouldn't sort of like let things like there's too much sort of can grow and thrive, if you know what I mean. For me, it's sort of like a spectrum where they're going back and forth, or authoritarian and loosening the controls. What would you say to this topic?
Yeah, I agree. I just want to go back on the parent thing as well. Someone might have shitty parents, for instance, and the lesson there is, don't behave like I have, or don't follow in my footsteps. So that in itself is a lesson as well. Unintentionally, it's not they're not purposely telling you how not to behave, but you should be able to pick up on that. Don't follow your parents if they're shitty parents. So they might be doing that to some extent as well. It's just another way to look at it. Like I said, I'm just about ideas. Just thinking about. That's what's always fascinated me is people's belief systems. Why do people believe the things they believe? And most of the time, it's because they're just following someone else's thought process. Reading it somewhere or seeing it on television. I mean, this is where language comes into it. It's just programming you. Perhaps that's why I stopped watching TV maybe, almost 30 years ago. But like you said, there are shows that are interesting and they're always trying to tell you something.
Yes.
What's another one? The Matrix is huge.
Oh, of course.
What's that one? The maritime one.
Who's in it? Tell me the actor.
Jesus. I gotta get it. I've just had a blank, that's all.
Describe something about it. I might be able to guess. I'm pretty good at remembering stuff.
Truman Show.
There you go, classic, yeah.
So, I mean, that whole show, and then, at the end, he's living in this fake reality that, TV reality that they've created for him. And so he's too afraid. He knows there's something wrong, and it doesn't feel real. And he senses that that his friends are fake, his wife's fake, but he's too afraid to leave, because what he has to do is actually give up his whole reality, his whole world at that point. And what's funny is, they've programmed him to be afraid of water, because they invented this story that his father drowned when he was younger. So, that connects to that whole water analogy as well there. And then in the end, when he is actually, he musters his courage and, he goes onto his little boat and he's preparing to exit the stage. The first thing he does is climb these steps, and, the backdrops are clouds. So it's like he's walking up to heaven, right? And then, he opens the door and he's about to exit the stage door, and he puts his arms outstretched like in the sign of the cross, because he's made the ultimate sacrifice, right?
Right.
It's a crucifixion. He's made the sacrifice to end that reality, right? And this is where people talk about what do they call it? The spiritual Christos, Christ isn't actually a person. It's a state that you have to reach.
So it's like consciousness, right?
Exactly.
Concept.
Exactly. Yeah. That's the term I was looking for. Yeah. So he's doing that, and then he's able to exit that fake world and live in the real world. And it's actually the guy who controls that whole television set is called Christoph. So Christov,
right?
It's all in there. It's in Hollywood. Hollywood does this. They try. Again, people look at Hollywood as well and say the evil, but they're trying to tell you. They tell you in all the films, what's going on as well. Yeah.
Yeah, that's actually something I found interesting, which is, again, notice how that doesn't actually really align with the idea it's just an overarching archonic evil conspiracy. Because as you say, why would you wouldn't get, like, essentially the joke here is, everyone makes fun of that famous trope from James Bond, the idea that the villain, before he's actually executed his plan, sits you down, the one person who can defeat him, and goes, listen, I'm just about to do it. Here's exactly, like, essentially that's what they're doing with these movies, mate, like you say, which wouldn't make any sense if they control, if it's like the outer limits and they control all the vertical and the horizontal and everything we see. Because I'm with you. Like, one of the interesting things, this is why, though, sadly, these things are so insidious. Because I'm with you. I know I should just turn off the TV and stop letting the program my mind up. But the problem is, now that I have this context and this model, in a way, it makes those shows better. Like, you can see how when I described that Silo show, I wasn't just watching it like, oh, this is a fun, crazy sci-fi concept. My brain was just going, oh, that's referring to how, like, society's siloed and how we're, you know, only certain people are allowed to know what actually the history of our world was, and were they the ones who built it, or did they lie and claim they did? I can already do that. Same thing with the Matrix. By the way, Truman Show's a banger, because what's great is people think of that as just a crazy, exactly. Oh, what an out there idea. And like, I actually think that's an amazing metaphor for just society. It's incredible, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it's a reflection of our reality, really. You know, they've created this construct that we all, you know, partake in, but, you know, the real world is slightly out of reach, because you've got to sacrifice this one in order to reach it. And, you know, who's prepared to do that?
Yes.
You know, and again, we go back to COVID. Who was prepared to give up their jobs and, you know, their, like you said, going to the cinema, or their lifestyle, whatever it was? Not many people were prepared to do that. No. Another good film is The Groundhog Day. I don't know if you've seen that.
Sure.
No, I mean, and the guy has to keep coming back until he gets it right. And I think sort of that's what we're doing here as well. You know, we have to come back here until we really understand our purpose and almost to grow in a sense. And I mean, this is through this idea is evident through Eastern doctrines.
Sure.
It's even in Christianity, but like I said, people do not read it properly. You know, I mean, I don't consider myself a Christian, but you know, I do think that those books are valuable.
Yeah.
If once understood correctly, it's just that most people don't understand them correctly. But you know, religion plays a big part in all this as well, because all this stems from religion as well.
Oh,
okay,
sure.
So if people are creating this society and this civilization and this economy, they're also giving you, you know, your belief system. So this is the other thing. If you're calling these people evil or Satanists, or they're the same people. So these people are the same people who gave you your religious texts.
Yeah.
You know, this is what I always try and tell people, and they get really upset with me. The merchant priest class are the ones that gave you everything, okay? They wrote your texts, they wrote your religion, they gave you the, you know, your trade and commerce, they gave you civilization.
They gave you the language, as your book points out.
Yeah. It all goes back to that. You know, I was able to trace it, like I said, the English language, I was able to trace it back to, you know, the city of London. Sure. and the merchant guilds there. And it's, you know, like I said, if you read my Substack, I've got lots of articles on that, and you know, I provide sources. I read a lot of books that are usually older books written in the 1800s.
Yes.
I just find that, I don't know.
By the way, that's probably the most bizarre thing. I think that's sadly another thing that puts people off conspiracy thinking, mate, is if you actually look into it, the joke is a lot of the actual like overt censorship only kicked in the 20th century. And I'm with you. The actual, there are so many mind-blowing books from the end of the 19th century about every topic of evolution, language, science, like language, all sort of law. It's why the famous thing, obviously everyone who's in the conspiracy world knows this one, that like, if you want to know really specific information about the law, especially in Anglosphere, you go and buy those really old legal dictionaries. You don't get the modern one where they twist it and change it and take thought. You get the really old one before. Because essentially the logic makes a lot of sense. Back then, no pleb like us would have had access to these books, mate. They'd be off in some amazing library somewhere. They weren't digitized on the internet. Like, I can see why you could that could be allowed to get out there, because it was fairly controlled. Like, there's not many people were encountering these ideas back then.
Well, reading a lot of these older texts, I found that towards the beginning of the 1900s, so the end of the 1800s, people were starting to ask all these questions that we are now.
Right.
So because especially with religion as well, Christianity, people were starting to question that quite a bit, because what was happening is a lot of the old texts from India and Persia, or, you know, that part of the world, the eastern part of the world, they didn't have access to them because they hadn't been translated. So once they were beginning to be translated, they were saying, oh my God, this reads exactly like, you know, the Christian Bible, or this,
yes,
you know, and then they can make the connection that this was borrowed from here. And they sort of shut it down. All right. They shut this down around, the 1930s, 1940s. And that's why I refer to a lot of the older books. So I think they were running scared around that time, and they had to do something about it. Take control over publishing and print media and television, and because a lot of people were starting to ask a lot of questions. That's what I found.
Sure. I mean, by the way, along these lines, another thing I would say as well is I actually found it quite interesting that you obviously relate so much of this specifically to the English language, because one thing I found really interesting is that's an area.
Why.
Go for it.
No, you go.
All right. Basically, I was just going to say this, which is people would think when you say a language, oh, well, we all learned that, didn't we? We were all talking. We have slang, we have dialects, we have things we build up. But with the words you're talking about, if people have never looked into some basic conspiracy stuff, the sheer amount of the English language that is just based on the King James Bible, so that's even in name written in part by the government, essentially, or Shakespeare, who obviously every modern literary conspiracy theory about Shakespeare is that he was some sort of intelligence agent or just some sort of an elite himself, like almost signaling information and building up our worldview of what we can say and so. And then lastly, the one I said, John Dee. If people don't know, as far as I can tell, John Dee actually tied. That's why I expected you to look into him. This is a guy where basically some of the things he did that was incredible is, think about that concept I said where they have to tell you something, but then they'll allow you, by omitting certain context, to take the wrong interpretation. So one of the famous stories about John Dee is the idea that he contacted angels and they taught him their language, which was called Enochian. And from that, yada, 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 somehow we just get like the British Empire, commerce, all these things. And it's like, if you think about this, right? Well, first of all, people have often said the English language itself, couldn't that be some variant of a language? Because essentially English does almost come out like some sort of powerful computer programming language, to use your metaphor. And it does seem like compared to certain other languages, it does change how you model and see the world. So yeah, go for it. Take it.
Okay. So John Dee worked for the Merciers livery company. So I believe a lot of the stuff that's attributed to him probably came out of his colleagues from that guild.
Right.
Okay. Now this guild is behind the Magna Carta. This guild is behind sending the Virginia Company to
like I said, forming the British Empire and stuff.
The merchant guilds are behind all of it.
Right.
So now they create these people like John Dee, or they attribute, what they're doing to these characters. So, it takes the eyes off them. I just wanted to point that out.
Yeah,
but going back
good.
to the language, now, in the conspiracy world, you've come across people saying, the Vatican runs everything. They're the ones behind everything, or the Jews are behind everything. The way I look at it is, what's the dominant language in the world today? It's English, right? So everyone's running, most of the world, and especially commerce and science, is run off the English language.
Yes.
I don't think you can even submit a paper, a scientific paper, if it's not in English. It just doesn't get looked at.
Right.
Okay, so English dominates the world. Okay, so that's the program everyone's running. So I look towards, then we're running off the English program, right? Not Latin, not the Vatican,
yes.
not Hebrew. We're running off English. So when I look at that, and then I say, all right, and then who's behind it? It's the merchant class. Again, they created the modern world, and they've created this modern construct that we see, which is predominantly, a materialistic, commercial world.
Yes.
Okay. Now, there has been only one movement in the modern world that has tried to stop it, and that's fascism. And that is why fascism is always,
the ultimate enemy, the evil, right?
The evil. You can't discuss it.
It's the foundational evil of our society, right?
Exactly. Everything evil is fascist.
Yes.
Okay. Okay. So that alone should make you want to look at it. When people say, "Don't look there, it's evil." It's evil. Why? But why is it evil?
Yeah.
Who does it threaten? Okay. It threatens the international merchant class. That's it. That's because fascism is the only system where you cannot have foreign ownership of trade and resources of a nation. Okay, so every other system, and this includes communism, you can have foreign investors. So just look at China. A lot of, it took off because of a lot of investment from overseas and overseas ownership. You can't do that in a fascist system. Okay, so that's why the merchants, consider it evil, and that's why it always has to be, put down and there are problems with fascism as well. Again, these are human systems. There's always going to be problems with them. But I'm saying, as far as the merchant class is concerned, that is their greatest threat, because that eliminates them as an entity. They can't do anything. They live off foreign trade. That's all they do, and investment. If you take that away from them, they're helpless. Okay, so
and it's also, if you think about how they maintain the power structure, right? Like, one of the most clever things about the globalist idea is the idea that, like, you and me can't really fix something small in our country because, like, that company's from China and then this one's funded by a part that comes from America, and you need this guy to have trade routes. And they've essentially made it so that, like, everything fails together. You have to sort of accept the whole system.
Yeah. I mean, they could change it if they wanted to, but like you said, it has to change from the top.
Yes.
They have to allow that system. They have to accommodate that system for it to change. Otherwise, like you said, if you try and change it, you're not going to do that.
Yes.
It's impossible. And English, what I believe is happening at the moment with English, and that's another reason I wanted to leave the English-speaking world, is this. Okay, I'll go back a bit. The merchants believe in astrology and astronomy. Okay, even though they poo-poo it, and it's given this sort of pseudoscience title.
I always tell people there's a reason why the main way you encounter it if you're a normal person in the Anglosphere is you see an idiot woman who's a psychic on morning TV. You get the agony aunt. They always give you like the gypsy woman doing the card read. They always give you the idiots. They give you one that makes it look like it's a scam, because that part is a scam. But that's obviously not the. They're not going to a gypsy person to get their cards read, mate.
No, exactly. Listen, this is what I found long ago. This merchant priest class discovered, right, that they could create wealth and manipulate. Now, this is going to sound wacky. You want to hear a conspiracy theory? Okay. They can influence the mind and behavior of people at certain times of a cycle. Okay. So if there's going to be a certain mindset, they can make it more intense, for instance. So for instance, COVID happened at a certain time that they knew they can take the maximum benefit from it. Okay? They planned their events around cycles. And these cycles has to do with celestial bodies like planets, the sun, the solar
equinoxes, radiation, all that stuff,
Yeah. It has to do with that, and it affects us. I mean, it has to do with electricity as well. Okay, that's just another word for plasma, and I don't know if you've looked into the electric universe theory.
Yeah, I'm quite into also the idea of like ether and stuff, and that's like spirit or something in the world. I think it's just a metaphor. Yeah.
So they plan off this. They work off cycles, and this is when it has to do with markets as well. So
but I often give the analogy, mate. It's just think about how farmer works. And again, if you don't know how like cycles of crops work, you would be a terrible farmer. But if you know, you can look like a magician, aren't you? Even all you're actually doing is manipulating a cycle you just discovered.
Exactly, and farmers knew this. They knew this this science, and this is probably why they've moved away from traditional farming, because because there's a hidden science they don't want you to know about, right? So they plan, the way they invest on the market, on the stock market, they follow these cycles. Okay, but it's not only about creating wealth; it's also about the manipulation of our thoughts and our behavior, our feelings as well. They follow this science, and that's how they plan their next moves, basically. Okay. Now I forgot what your initial question was because I went off on a tangent.
It was more about like English, if you remember, like the way that as a specific language people see the world differently.
Okay. So
go on.
Yeah, exactly. Good point. So this cycle for them, this English cycle is ending. Okay.
Oh, right.
Yeah. Well, you look at history and you look at world powers. They don't always stay in power
No,
forever.
sure.
Okay. So, and then there's that theory that we're in the dark ages or the iron age.
Okay.
And then you've got the golden age. Do you know what I mean? These cycles, these
Sure.
ages that last thousands of years. And we're moving out of Pisces as well. So, which I believe we're already in Aquarius. Okay, because it's not this sharp transition from one to the other. It takes hundreds.
Oh, does this also tie in then to the idea that that's why, like, the whole theme of the previous language system was water-based, but then Aquarius is going to be an air-based one, I'm guessing.
Exactly.
Is the angle you go
this
for,
is
right?
why.
Right.
Exactly. This is why you see cryptocurrency, and I believe the air sign came into. We started moving into it with the invention of television and phones,
Right, sure.
and airplanes, and because that's the initial part of it, and then now we're moving into the air currency rather than water-based currency. It's air-based. That's why you got crypto and like I said, radio. These are all air-based inventions. Okay, so this is why I believe we're in it. Okay, we're at the beginning, but we're in it. So. A new age and a new system requires what? A new program. A new program is a new language. So this is why I think the English-speaking nations, above all others, are going through this crazy transition. I mean, you look at England and, Australia, Canada, America, they seem to be affected more than most with the changes happening in the world.
Oh, sure.
So, yeah, that's the reason for it. Well, that's what I believe the reason for it. Yeah.
Because one thing you hinted at, actually, I wanted to ask you about in your book is there's a part where you just, again, very briefly, just sort of hint at the idea that, like, obviously English itself was built on Latin, but that Latin is a very different type of language in terms of how it has this effect. Like, you describe it more as, like, Latin's more like a logical language where, like, you can sort of see the mechanisms and how things fit together. Whereas, like, one of the things you were describing that fit into a lot of my own thinking about English is I notice English seems, by the way, like the perfect language to do what we were just discussing, to explain ideas to people, but in a way where if you don't see it, it will just be invisible to you. It'll just sound like a bunch of words. But if you get what they mean, it will immediately be apparent what they're saying. Because one thing I've noticed people are able to do in English, I'm taking your word for it on Latin. I haven't studied it, obviously. But if Latin's more of like a logical language, I would say English as a language is defined by the fact a lot of it is like visual metaphors. And it's about things like, I notice a lot of the conspiracy thinking is, they will explain to you a concept or a process, but they'll describe it as an external story, often in fiction. But actually, oftentimes it involves like internal processes or concepts about the world and how you see it. Is there some difference in Latin in that sense?
I believe, all languages have their strengths, right? And weaknesses. English was used to get us to a certain point. Okay, so it's like, you're not going to use Windows 3 to do some of the things that Windows 11 can do. You're never going to. So you view language like that, like a program. So English was developed using Latin as a base. I think 40% of their words are based on Latin, and then Norman French and Old English. So, but if you hear Old English, it sounds nothing like the English we're speaking today. So it was molded. It was molded to create this language for this purpose. That to create this modern world and this construct. But with the new age, they're going to need something else. And now it all depends where they want to head. If they want to head somewhere more spiritual, perhaps Latin isn't the ideal language for that. People tell me, oh, it's got to be something like Sanskrit or something like that. But I mean, I don't see that happening. But or it could be an old language revived and modified. And this is where I believe it could be Latin, because Latin connects us to our past, right? It was the language spoken throughout Europe, which united all the European people.
Sure.
A lot of the modern languages are based on Latin in some way, like French, Spanish, Italian, German. So, what it does is it takes us back. So it takes our minds back. And this is what I hear a lot of people say, that the modern world's gone too far. We need to go back a little bit. We need to step back, So, maybe that will help us in that regard. But I also believe that we need to sort of go back to more of a spiritual path. So I don't know, Latin was used as a first language by the church. Perhaps, it has something to offer in that regard. I don't know, but It seems it does.
By the way, being as your alias you chose is the Phoenician Hunter. And I do notice, fully on brand, you do manage to make a whole book almost and it always goes back to the Phoenicians, which is cool. But I will say this, here's the question I have for you. One thing I was able to tell, obviously, like I said, I haven't read your Substack, unfortunately, but one thing I was able to infer from even just the titles of some of the pieces you've written there is you do tie to a couple of ideas. So one of them is this idea that if you go back to the Phoenicians, and if people don't know, I'm not super done on some of this history, but as far as I know, people like the Babylonians were followed on from some of the ideas of the Phoenicians. I can tell you that absolutely, when I've looked into it, this ties into your idea of why they do things at certain times. This might sound like a crazy concept to people, but just as you said, essentially farming is it's almost like a sort of secret technology of reality. It's
a science. Yeah, exactly.
Where essentially you almost have to learn. I mean, I would even say, I think spiritual lessons actually imply things about reality in this sense. In a same sense, I actually think a lot of people don't understand that is literally what finance markets and business is about. As far as I can tell, wealth and money is literally a Phoenician or Babylonian concept about, it's essentially it's essentially like alchemical thinking applied to whatever money is. It's about people genuinely, I mean, the words are even built in them, the idea of growing money and harvesting and yield. And again, it's not something people think it's just an arbitrary thing we invented, again, just for the control and the money and that. There's something grander about this, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, and money is a form of magic as well. I mean, you're creating something from nothing, going back to that term, the Phoenicians, well, they didn't actually refer to themselves as Phoenicians.
Okay.
It was the Greeks that called them that because I think they called the land, they came from the land of purple. So that's where that word comes from. They refer to themselves as Canaanites. And
oh, wow. That's pretty deep if you know the Bible, man. That's kind of wild, yeah.
But in the Bible, Canaanites means merchant or trader. So it's not a name of it's not a name of a race or a group. It's a title, okay? So it means trader or merchant. And that's why I've called myself Phoenician Hunter. I'm hunting these merchants. Who are they? Where do they come from? Yeah. So, I don't look at them like a race of people.
Right.
Okay?
I see what you mean, because I will say often people just tie literally the Phoenicians to the ideas of Atlantis and a lost race and stuff. But I know what you mean. Essentially, one thing you're hinting at, which I also think is a key concept for the modern world, is it doesn't really. This is where people in the conspiracy world thinking about bloodlines are sort of onto it, but they haven't gone further. It's more the idea that these people don't think of themselves as Australian, English, etc. No. They see themselves as separate, and they're almost above that. And if you actually look in history, I saw some of your work implies this, they do sort of move around the world and go to different cultures and change names. And I noticed you were definitely hinting in some of these frames at things like Flamenco's idea that some of history is fabricated, or the black nobility of Venice and how they've changed names. And I see you're sort of hinting at some of these things with breadcrumbs potentially, right?
Yeah, I mean, they move with the empires. Right. So they move, and then where they move to, they create this power base and this superpower. I mean, yeah, and all you need to do is follow the superpowers in the world, and you'll see the same group of people, the same way of doing things. Their traits, you can follow their traits. That's why I always look at their traits and characters, not names, not races.
I mean, it's a famous detail that they just change names and races and adopt other people's names and stuff, right?
I mean, why would you be that silly to keep the same names?
Yeah,
you'll be easily found out that way, So, but I follow the character, and I wanted to point on something too. With language, it evolves. It evolves as well with time, and so there's a lot of words that we no longer use in English, or new words that are introduced, or words change their meaning as well, as over time. And in my book, I sort of introduced this water-based or maritime theme to the language, and I had this discussion with someone, early on when I was talking about, the birth canal and seamen and all the
Sure.
nautical characters present in the language, and said, oh yeah, but that's just because back then when they were developing the language, all they had were ships for transportation, and ships played a big part, which I found ridiculous, because I could prove that even today with new technologies and new inventions, they're continuing.
Yes. I mean, you did a very good job pointing out how the internet takes the exact same theme and puts it online. Yeah, exactly.
Well,
online, the net,
online.
yeah, all that shit.
Yeah, if you want to go through, the internet, net, surf. What do you do when you're on the net? You surf in the net. Yep. Your computer, you've got ports. So yeah. Another one was pirates, which I found interesting.
That's a good one.
So if you steal something on land, you're called a criminal, but if you steal online on the internet, you're called a pirate.
Yes.
So yeah, they're continuing this theme. So yeah, I just wanted to bring that up because I just thought it was something very interesting.
Sure. I mean. Well, maybe I could ask you this question then. What do you think about that detail I said there about how, because I do see that as like a metaphor, is like essentially, as far as I can tell, money itself, like you say, is quite literally using magical techniques of how people's like minds attach to symbols and things. But also, like I say, actually the development and growth of money is almost has a parallel to how like crop cycles exist and things in the natural world.
In what way?
I mean, as far as I can tell, like, put it this way, people have written whole books about this, about how, like, if you ever look at even the symbology of like the dollar and how it's green, and like if you even look at what the dollar symbol originally signifies, it's like a snake and something.
Yeah, the snake.
Yeah, this all ties into literal. I always tell people it's funny that magic is always presented as like weird people off in a corner doing something on their own, but that's just one specific like cross section of it. Actually, as far as I can tell, it's the other way around. Almost everything that's presented as like this is the way the world works in science is just like a very, very shallow version of trying to describe sort of alchemical processes in the world, if you know what I mean.
Magic is just science and not understood.
Yes, great way to say it, yeah.
That's all it is, is people haven't figured it out yet. So the way I view magic as well is just, spell, you cast a spell. I mean, that's what magic is. And how are you doing that? You're doing that with words. And what's a word? Do you break that down further? And then what's that? It's a vibration, right? It's a sound. It's a vibration. And then what are vibrations? And vibrations affect us, right? They affect our emotions, our feelings. So that in a sense is magic, right?
Sure.
So you just, the way people speak to you, they can speak to you, rudely, lovingly. It affects you in different ways. And then again, if we bring in the cycles, like I said, which were, connected to electricity and solar. And I mean, you just go out into the sun and see how the sun affects you and the heat.
Sure.
Like I said, for some people it's magic. It's just that they've understood this science and most people haven't. So that's why it seems like magic to most people. They've understood it. They've understood how it works and how it affects you. Most people haven't. They haven't figured that out, or they don't want to know.
No, but what's funny is when you actually were talking about that, by the way, that even made me realise, like I can give someone a very obvious metaphor that I hope all the men listening would understand, which is this is where so much of the problem that like nerdy men come into in the world is. Because we're doing that thing where we're like the turbo normie that thinks English is just like what the word describes. We're not actually looking at the fact of like, no, but it's hinting a model as to how it connects to something else. Like, well, essentially, one thing you described that I think is brilliant is essentially if you actually pay attention to what the words are saying in English, they also describe the function and the mechanism of the concept being described. Like a great example you give actually, but you didn't go deeper on in the book, is if people don't know, this is a classic one I know as someone who's English and British, mate, which is the concept of being double-crossed literally just comes from the British Union Jack, because guess what? Britain, hence why they had that famous name around the world, Perfidious Albion, is pretty well known for just double-crossing and betraying people once they make a deal with you. Like that's
exactly.
Actually, well, the problem is we just think about like the idea of like, oh, they've turned back on it. It's like, no, that's literally coming from the idea British people were doing that so much that became associated with their famous simple, as it were. And one of the areas I would say that this ties in, a perfect example, like I said, if you're a nerdy guy, is you might think, why is my girlfriend mad at me? All I said to her was X and Y. It's like, no, mate, she heard your tone. Essentially, everything except the words actually communicate to her what you are really thinking in your mind. Like, you know what, you are actually pissed off with her or frustrated. You think you're saying, but I just said, oh, honey, I don't want to do that now. Like, you're not getting that there's a whole aspect of communication that she's getting. She's essentially right, mate. We're being a bit silly thinking we're trying to be like a defense lawyer, but you'll find I didn't say exactly that, Your Honour. We're like trying to argue our way out of it. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I believe that's where most of the problems between men and women. Like my wife would always say to me, it's not what you said, it's how you said
it. Absolutely. Yes.
Women are more sensitive and in tune to this stuff, all right? So that's why they can feel that vibration.
Which, by the way, notice how that's what again, that's how clever the people who set the system up is, mate. They always let you do the mistake. So what they do is they don't tell you women are idiots and don't know anything. What they do is they set up a world in which all we respect is super artistically literal, scientific, rational thinking, so that then what we think is, even if I was to do like what you were saying there, I agree with you. I actually think women have a sort of intuitive intelligence that is incredible. But the joke is you will get a man like me to dismiss it by going, oh, they're just in their emotions and their feelings. It's all vibes and stuff. And that sounds silly until you realize that's another entire way of seeing the world.
Yep, and also they're more in tune with those cycles I was talking about earlier.
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay, and a lot of men listening to this will laugh and say that's just an excuse. No, I know for a fact that these cycles work and they have an effect on us. And women are more sensitive to them than we are.
I mean, you could even put it this way, if you want to go down a tangent on the side, you could even imply that's one of the reasons why, en masse, they've in the Western world pushed birth control, because it takes women out of their cycles and out of these concepts and makes them,
definitely,
almost see themselves as a consumer product that's just a part of a normal world with no cycles. And you know what I mean?
Yeah, and also why they've brought them into the workforce, making them more into men.
Yes.
And taking them away from their natural. Their natural state. I'm not saying their natural state should be just, making babies, but, traditionally they were the wise, they were the healers, so obviously got a role to play that they've been purposely taken away from.
And some of the most important roles, as you're saying, like the other joke there is, even built within the feminist thinking, is the idea they're repeating the idea that those are inferior jobs. Those are by definition the most important jobs.
Yeah. Yeah. Going back to what you were saying about the clues in the word, there was a couple in my book that I just wanted to highlight where, you go to school to be, switched on. Do you remember that in the book when I got that?
Yes.
So you got to be switched on like a light. And, but when you're in school, you get less-ons. So if you break that word up, less on means light to turn on a switch, right?
Yes.
So if you're getting less of that, less on, you're becoming dumber. You're not becoming smarter. And if you don't go to school, what do they call you? Moron. Now, if you break up that word again, you're getting more of the light, more on. So the words, the clues are in the words.
Yeah. By the way, I tell you my actual favourite one from the book. Because again, first of all, one thing you did a really good job with is people on other talks tend to just have one or two of these and they just sprinkle it in. And their problem is because it's not like sort of comprehensive enough in how it connects to the other details. Again, you will just see an individual tree instead of the woods, as it were, in that analogy I gave earlier. Yeah. So one of the ones I actually thought was the most brilliant in that book, mate, is actually essentially how you describe the two political wings of left wing and right wing. That's exactly what we're talking about. Literally within the words themselves and their etymology and definition, it describes their function. So as you say, the left wing, basically left in Latin, comes out of this word that's similar to the word sinister and is basically about the idea that it's actually about emotion ruling you and what you feel, whereas right wing is about the idea of like what is right, what is morally good. And if you ever look at the way, even the extremes of the two, left and the right wing, that is exactly what it is, especially in the modern day, if you think about it. Like, that's why people perceive like left wing people as more empathetic, and they like And if you notice, you would say that's the strength on some level, because if it's channeled correctly, they are going to care about people. But obviously the negative is they can be tricked into feeling strong emotion for things that are wrong and led down the path. Whereas if you think about right-wing people, in theory, they would obviously, it's why so many of them are like Christian, they would describe themselves as, I care about things like family and society and order, but they can obviously
morality,
be led towards authoritarian systems in their own way. So I thought even just the way you described that, I've never seen someone put that together. I've seen, the odd part separately. I think if someone saw that, they would immediately see what we're talking about how the word simultaneously describes something, but also outlines its function, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, and another point you brought up is I was able to decipher the language by knowing another language as well. So not knowing a bit of a bit of Latin and Italian helped me decipher some of these words, like the word left in Italian, in Latin and Italian, it's translated as sinistra, which we get the word sinister from. So that's why I was able to break that apart, and then you get the true meaning of the words. And the left and right, we can, our brain is made up of left and right hemispheres. So, it's up to us which side we levitate to. Everyone can view things, from the right point of view, the right hemisphere or the left. But it just seems to me that, like you were saying, a lot of these people who attach feelings to everything are using too much of one side of the brain and not the other. So, because I find you can take, either view on a topic, and you're not necessarily going to be 100% incorrect on that, viewpoint. Like you said, a lot of people, left-leaning people, have a good heart.
Absolutely,
a lot that I know, they're just trying to help people and they're trying to do good, but they don't understand the way they're going about it is harmful.
I mean, people, I'll put it this way. I would say the area which people might be able to relate to what we're talking about the most is when people put up the gender divide online, especially. Because again, if you follow the sort of people, the circle that we're in on Twitter, listen, I find it funny to be a Call of Duty gamer lobby guy from 20 years ago, go, ha ha ha, I'm saying something edgy. But that can only go so far. There's too many right-wing people, mate, have just made that their whole personality, and their whole meme that never stops is like, lol, aren't women stupid idiots? And it's like, not really, mate. Even when we're talking about, for example, there's obviously a lot of left-wing women that might be immediately spring to mind when we talk about this topic of the idea of just being in your feelings. Well, I always say it this way. There's actually a sort of a white pill in there, mate, which is like, yes, maybe people who are in control of the media can manipulate women's empathy so it becomes almost suicidal or pathological, and it becomes a negative to society. But the white pill there is, one, notice they have to continually propagandize to do that and to push you in those areas, which implies to me that if you actually left people to their sort of natural devices, that would essentially be a very positive impulse in women. That would be what would make them be very vigilant about their children or caring for people who are more needy. These are things that can be excellent if applied the right way. It depends if people channel it into a sinister, fully enough perfect use, a sinister approach, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, it's when people adopt it, and they make it their identity that's the problem, and then they just become extremists, and I see people's profiles like you have, and everything's about a certain, belief system or identity that they've attached to themselves. Really, if you strip that all away, that's not who you are, and I don't understand why people do that. A lot of religious people do that. I mean, you go on their profiles and it's Christ is King, and they quote this part from the Bible, and it's like, just, relax. I'm not saying there's no God and that, but just you don't need to, project it, so much. You don't have to make it part of everything that you identify with. It doesn't help anyone. It doesn't help you, and it doesn't help the people around you. Yeah. So it's the same with what you're talking about with the left and the right, extremes there. Yeah.
I mean, one thing as well that you addressed with one of these word breakdowns that I thought was really brilliant too was the one on the word individual, where it actually contains the notion of dividing people, because that's one of the biggest psyops that I have to admit, mate. I only a few years ago even figured this one out, which is, if you would have asked me, and this is why language and especially mental models, I can tell you as a weird aside, one of the areas that fascinates me about this is when I'm in these competitive video game environments. So you don't have to know about video games. Think about things like chess or football or any sport that you follow. follow. At the top level, there is always a meta game of how people are playing the game and thinking about the game and what the best current tactics are, right? And if you have that approach, if you don't understand the most advanced metagame, you will lose to that metagame. You won't be able to see like how it operates, what the counters are, how it works, etc. And so what I would say is when people look at this, at the world, in the modern day, when you grow up with the traditional schooling system and media, one of the cleverest psyops ever is that at the base of all thinking, you believe in the following statement, which is, I am an individual and being an individual over the collective is the most important thing in the world. And if you get caught in that psyop, and I was in it for a long time, mate. The genius.
I was too.
We all are. I just say it to be sort of generous to the listeners. I don't want them to feel like I'm better than them and I'm condescending to them. We were all idiots and we all got caught by all these tricks. But one of the things I always tell people is that in itself is genius, because if you want to control someone, get them on their own. Get them such as you. Whereas if you think about it, it's why, as you say, when you say fascism, you're going to scare people, mate. But I know what you mean. I would just say ideas like one of the areas I've gone back in time, mate, to recontextualize how I think of the world is I try not to think of myself as an individual now. I think of myself as my family is the unit and my extended family is like almost my nation, as it were. My people are my nation. You know, I expand out.
That's the way you should.
Well, it's how we used to do it, obviously, 1,000 years ago or something, essentially. Like, I mean, you've seen it in all these shows, all these fantasy shows. Game of Thrones are telling you this is all about bannermen and coalitions and so But if you're an individual, it's too easy to control you and to push your buttons and to manipulate it. I actually think wanting to be an individual stops you ever having a power base to do anything.
That's the point of it. That's why they pushed that.
Right.
And what you're saying is, you know, to be part of a nation or a group, that's the natural state, because animals do that as well. Okay, they stay in their groups. It's natural. If we were brought, you know, if you took away all this civilization and all this technology, that's what we would do. We would just herd in our natural groups. It's just what would happen. So the reason they did was that to break up the communities. And if you look at that word community, it's got common unity.
Yes.
So, okay, because like you said, they can pick you off one by one like that. You're not a threat. You know, you're a threat if you're in a large.
Also, notice how this ties into an idea that's a very topical one. But if you've noticed, I try not to say like what I call the cursed words out loud. I just refer to the abstract idea. So you'll get what I mean by this. Okay. If you notice, that's why when they use language, they try to brainwash you currently. That community just means anyone who lives in your city and has citizenship. And in doing so, that's genius, because as you say, if we take that word and we look at the idea of a common unity, like we all think and believe the same things and agree on the same things, that is the foundation of civilization. But if community is just every possible disparate slice of the ideology and worldview and religion, by definition, that could never actually be the basis of anything. It will always be against, there's too many mutually exclusive ideas and things that don't sort of overlap, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, and the result of that is, again, it's all done on purpose. That's globalism and multiculturalism, and that's because we're going to be all fighting amongst ourselves. Yes. Okay, like you said, for different, you know, beliefs, ideas, and there's no harmony, and they can just sit on top and look down and laugh.
Oh, and as you say, by the way, they can do what you did, mate. They can go, I don't like the way things are going in this country. I tell you what, we'll set this up to be this little colony doing this over here. We'll nip off to this other area of the world where the next, you know, tech rush is, or the next bubble of capitalism and stuff.
Yeah, but I actually went back to my roots though. So
fair enough.
I didn't just go off to, it looks better, it's safer and better over there, I'm going to go there. I actually thought I wanted to connect with my heritage, and I wanted my children to have that kind of connection as well, because living in a multicultural country, it means nothing. You don't really belong to anything. There's, you know, when everything is a melting pot, there's no cohesion. You don't feel part of anything.
Sure.
So that's what I was feeling there, and that's what I didn't want for my children. So yeah.
Well, one thing you're hinting at, by the way, is I actually thought the point you made earlier, we can expand on that a little bit. When you said that you had to learn when you learned another language is what gave you the insights into the original language. There's a really, really famous piece of poetry that everyone will know when I say it, where it says, "What do they know of England, those who only England know?" It's something like that. And the gist of it is, it's the idea of why people think world travel's so important. I actually think people have got it the wrong way around. People think world travel's brilliant because you go elsewhere and you see everyone's the same. Notice this is a totally globalist idea. You go there and you go, "Hey, we're all just the same, but one of us was born here, one of us," and it's the opposite. You go elsewhere, and what you actually realize is how different your culture and people are from other peoples and cultures in the world. Like the joke is, I myself would have had very naive ideas from things like TV and movies, especially how they cast people in these shows, of what the rest of the world was like if I hadn't have been around the world for my job and for certain work things where I've worked with many people from other countries. Because I can tell you, like, I'll give you the most basic one that someone in the Anglosphere you'll be able to relate to. One of the most immediately jarring things about multiculturalism is when you find out that you thought life and being a normal person was about ideas like being polite and having manners and doing things like, obviously for Anglosphere, queuing and, saying I'm sorry when you bump into someone. You very quickly learn, mate, when you encounter other cultures. Some of them don't have that at all. And in fact, sometimes they go the opposite direction,
Exactly. I mean, and just on that, I mean, why would you want a world where everything was the same in any way? I mean,
sure,
it's beautiful having all different, cultures and customs and traditions. Even if you might not agree with them, they're still, you can still appreciate them, So, there's certain places I don't interest me in going to visit but they have a right to exist, they have a right, and they make other people happy, and I just find this, push towards this, one world. It's just, I just find it boring and ugly. If it's just going to be all one and we're all the same, it's just like playing the one video game over and over again.
Sure.
Going back to your video game analogy.
Also, another thing I do notice as well is if you look at, by the way, one thing I think is quite interesting is people will know the idea that like the British Empire was involved with mercantilism. Because I often tell people, another one of the wackest psyops of all time is the idea that all of history was either monarchy, capitalism, or communism. And that is probably the stupidest, like, reductive way of looking at the world ever. I always tell people, in the same way as people will go, well, in a way, isn't America like an empire because they have all these sort of like commercial colonies? It's like, that is what the British Empire was. In fact, the joke is when you look at how all the companies and stuff worked, it wasn't really like the government doing it. It's more like they literally gave charters to companies, and companies did it all. They did all the exploring of the world and all the exploitation. That wasn't even people doing that, like as in the people of England. No. It was essentially what in the modern day could be a corporation from America. It just happened to be in Britain at the time, right?
Brilliant. I'm glad you brought that up. I view America as an extension of the British Empire.
Yes.
Okay, or more accurately, the extension of the East India Company. To me, America is just the East India Company on steroids. Okay, yes. They've even got the same bloody flag. I mean,
yeah, exactly.
Again, they just bloody tell you and they show you if you're smart enough to decipher it. And like you said, it was the merchants that did this. So the sovereign really didn't have as much power as people believe.
Yes.
So what the merchants did they would go to the sovereign and say, listen, we've got this idea, we'll get your approval, because it sort of almost needs to be sanctioned by someone else, someone in authority. And they said, we'll make you rich in the process, we'll give you, shares. And that's what happened. So, when the Virginia company went to America, the shares in that company were owned by merchants. And the king had some shares, but it was predominantly merchants, the merchants from the city of London. And yeah, it's all these merchants that are doing this stuff. And like I said, there's the same merchants that move throughout history and throughout time. And, the version we have now is just the English version, but before that it was someone else. It was the German or the Latin, the Christian version, and before it was the Dutch and
yes.
The Venetians and the Genoese. So like I said, you can follow this power shifting. The Spanish even had a period there where they would
think about South American stuff, of course. Yeah.
And it's not the country doing this. It's like you said, it's companies. Like so, it's the East India Company, the Dutch East India Company, Virginia Company, whatever. There's plenty of others, and it's companies, and that's the world we live in, and it's not. it's not only the modern world. It's been like that for a very long time. So this is the other thing that people don't realize. These companies, they've existed. I've traced them back to ancient Rome.
Well, it's why I notice you don't just say company, you always do say things like guild, because obviously that goes back a long way back. And then you think about things like all those mystery school things were tied into that stuff back then.
Yeah, what happened was they divided people into guilds. So, if you wanted to be a glassmaker or, a fishmonger or whatever, you're part. That's it. You're part of a guild. So then you pay like membership to this guild, and you get a license to trade.
Yes.
This was a way for the cities to control the trade, and so there wasn't anything illegal happening. People weren't being ripped off or whatever, or poisoned or whatever. So they can just control, the trade and commerce in their cities. And then these guilds grew into companies, smaller companies, and then bigger companies, and then then they're the ones that develop banks as well. I mean, I've got a post on the Bank of England. People think it was the Crown that did that, or the monarch. It wasn't. It was these trade guilds that created the Bank of England. So it all goes back to this.
One thing I notice you don't hit on very much. Look, obviously it's because your book again is like a primer. Is one thing you didn't explicitly hit, but is implied in this is again another classic area. Anyone's listening to John Maxwell will have heard this, but they just won't have connected to the bigger concept. Is when you look into ideas like what is the City of London, which famously isn't London the city, the massive area. It's this very small, I think it's almost like a square mile or something within the centre. Yep. And essentially the metaphor you have to use, this is what people don't connect though, is in the same way as the Vatican isn't actually Italy, it's a separate area that's its own state with its own controls. The genius of this is, I'll give people the analogy. This is like if you were playing one of those big MMO games, World of Warcraft or something. If within that you were a part of a clan or a guild of people, right? And you had a secret area you could go to that was like your hideout. That's what these areas almost are like. Like exactly. These people quite literally are even beyond like certain legal controls when they go into these areas and do things under these names. Like essentially that's why you have to see almost like essentially if we want to use the matrix metaphor, the matrix is all this like corporatism, right?
Yeah, and that's like you said, it's a safe space, right?
Right.
And that's what I believe Israel is too. It was created for that purpose. Okay.
If you look at some of the criminals who run there, it certainly seems like it, mate. I know you mean it seems like their home base, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, like if you're an Israeli citizen and you do something in America or in another country, you just flee to Israel and you're protected, So it's the same.
In the same way, by the way, as the analogy goes, people know the stories about dodgy priests and the Catholics and they flee to Vatican City and they just get protected there. Like I think people can get that one, but they don't realize it's going on all around the world on a much bigger level. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah. And it works with finances too. Banks, Switzerland, you can't touch certain bank accounts and these people have protected themselves. Let's put it that way.
Oh, mate, I can tell you as someone British, that was one of the other ones that really opened my eyes this is why I agree with you. I almost do see the world as almost like, here's a good analogy. Think of like one of those old school 90s video games where it's a point and click adventure. And when you go to each section, of course, that's why I bring it up. And if you're a nerd, by the way, these were the best games ever. And one of the best things about them is that obviously the option you pick in Monkey Island or wherever it is, Day of the Tentacle or something, the options you pick determine how the adventure goes. You choose the adventure, but there are right and wrong answers. And if you pick the right ones, you will get to where you want to go and it'll all work out. And if you pick the wrong ones, you will end up in an area where you're fucked. So I notice along these lines, like that is another thing about how they're setting this up is like the idea that you either see it or you don't, but they're telling you the whole time.
Yeah. And I believe they're trying to push you in a certain direction as well. Like you said, there's certain words that you have to choose in those games that you're referring to. There's only like 3 or 4 selections. I believe they're sort of doing that as well to some extent as well. So it sort of goes back to that film I was mentioning earlier, Groundhog Day, and they're trying to make you see what is your purpose here. That's what they're making me do anyway. Not me personally, this is what I've taken out of this whole, my research into this. Evaluate my purpose here on Earth, and what is my purpose, and it's not to accumulate wealth or and I don't understand how some people just make their whole life about something like I don't know, fashion, for instance, and that's it. Fashion is their life, and how they're viewed by other people physically. Surely there's got to be more to it. Your time here is precious. Make it about something more than that.
Well, actually, that touches on something I did want to ask you, which I do think you almost hinted at the beginning about something like that. So let me ask more explicitly, which is one thing that initially I thought was a black pill, but I kind of don't mind it as much now because I think it relates to what we were talking about earlier about the idea that like the system almost tells you, like, if you want to study this and figure it out, you can figure it out. And you'll see when I'm sort of winking at you what you should do. But if you don't want to, if you want to be a blind follower, I've got that system set up too. You can follow that your whole life from cradle to grave. I'll tell you what to do. And if that's who you are, then that's the system for you. You get to pick which it is. Like, essentially, I think people think it's the case that like they want everyone to fail in this sense, but I know what you mean. Here's the question I want to ask you is, I don't find it depressing, but I think it's a hard realization when people get into these topics that when you then turn around, like the guy I described at the beginning, who then breathlessly tries to tell a friend or a family member, listen, you've got to know about this, and then the Templars, and then if you do that, one thing you'll very quickly realize is some people genuinely don't want to know. It's like another thing, as someone who's a bit of a nerdy autistic guy, one of the biggest realizations in my life, even though to other people it'll seem so obvious, and you guys probably all figured this out in the playground, is most people aren't, when they speak, trying to express honestly what their brain is considering and they believe. They're actually thinking of things like, well, how will people think about what I say? Is this something that will make me popular, or will I be excluded? Will I be praised for this? Other people are thinking on a very different level. So essentially the question is, do you get the sense that a lot of people potentially aren't supposed to figure these things out? They wouldn't even want to. They would want to be led. They would want to be told. They would want a daddy basically to tell them what to do. Do you think that's the case?
Yeah, and fear comes into it as well. Right. People are afraid of this, disrupting this construct that they've built. Like, going back to that movie, The Truman Show,
Sure.
They fear. Like, I've got a close friend of mine who, he knows what I do. He follows my Substack, but he doesn't read my articles. He just sort of hovers. He looks at the titles, and he says, I've got so much going on in my life. I mean, we all do. Yeah. But the way I look at it is there's nothing more important than this, But, he's like, I've got work and, the family and also he just doesn't want to disrupt this worldview that he's created, right?
Yes.
With asking these questions and probably dismantling that whole worldview and then having to reconstruct it again, because he feels safe in it,
Of course.
And it might not be perfect, right? But it's all he knows. So, that's what he's going to stick. People stick with what they know.
Yes.
Yeah. And I've tried to speak to people with this stuff. And like you said, you can't force it. People come to it when they're ready. I mean, no one forced this information onto me. I went looking for it. And I think that's the best way to approach it. And there's not going to be many people doing that.
No.
Maybe that's the point. I think it's just like with the COVID. How many people didn't get vaccinated? Very few. Very few. 15% of the population. That's what
I think in many ways, I think that's the best modern metaphor, because isn't that exactly what I'm talking about? There was a lot of people where you could have literally led them down the path and showed them how this paper follows into this and this person's like that. But what you realize eventually is they don't want to know that, mate. Like, they don't. The last thing they want to know is what people like me and you who think we're in the movie rather than the truth think, which is like, it's all a scam and they're all lying to you. They don't want to find that out. That'd be really alarming to them. The last thing they want to think is, wait a minute, my doctor might be trying to fuck with me and tell me the wrong things. I don't want that. I want the world where he's a kindly guy just telling me what I should do to help myself, and everyone's here to help me and get along, and we're all part of a society, and all those things we all say.
Yeah, and it's money underneath all those things that you mentioned too. I mean, it's just I view the medical industry and all that. It's just a business. Come on, just look at it. What is it?
I think someone gave me the best analogy I've heard, which is, in the same way as we all go and get our car fixed by a mechanic. Yeah, but we all know the mechanic's trying to fleece us if he can, if we let him, and try and put extra stuff in there and charge extra. Like, if you just think of a doctor that way, he is trying to fix the car based on his methods, but he's also going to make money on the side, of course.
Yeah, I mean, they're happy to accept, the mechanic screwing them over, but they don't extend it. They don't extend it to the doctor.
They can't do the doctor, the teacher, the government person. They have to believe those people are all earnestly just pure, for some reason.
Well, I believe that most of them, believe the things they do and say. They're
absolutely.
I don't believe that.
Oh, by the way, genuinely, I think 99% of doctors during COVID really did. That was the material they were told to study. That's right. Of course, yeah. They weren't provided the alternatives, of course.
No, they just believe the system. They rely on the system. The system's been great to them. So they
By the way, notice that's even part of how it works, mate, because that's why, the famous thing people tell you if you're a conspiracy guy is they go, no, but it can't be that because my dad's friend does that job and he's a good guy. And you know what? They're not wrong. They are right. Yeah. He is probably a good guy. He is the guy you meet when you go down the pub. He just doesn't know about this deeper shit we're talking about.
Yeah, but it's also human nature. We've just... we accept what authority tells us, and why would we think that they're out to screw us? It's not what what first comes into your brain. No. I view it differently, but not many people view it the way we do. That's the thing, and maybe people too are afraid to believe that everyone else is out to get them. There's also that aspect to it. They don't want to believe that, there are people out there that can harm them or who want to purposely, harm them or fleece them. Yeah.
Sure. Oh, no, by the way, I'll even say as well, this is another area I'll offer an olive branch to people who are normies who are listening, which is I now can see myself. This is one of the reasons why it took me a long time to come back to ideas, I say, like not being an individual and enjoying tradition and things that had value in the past, is because one of the areas I couldn't see it is, as you can probably tell by the way I'm talking, I was the sort of kid who always rebelled against authority, mate. I always viewed all authority as negative. So that's why you can see why conspiracy stuff was very appealing to me. The idea, they're all full of shit anyway. Yeah, you shouldn't listen to any of them. But when I've had to learn it, it's like, it's not as simple as that either. And obviously, like I say, I think I don't know if it's natural, but based on the circumstances of my life, I'm someone who's more inclined to question authority in that sense. Whereas, as we're saying, like, put it this way, if I was the same person, but maybe social things or the way school had gone differently, maybe I would be the person who's just on the track where, I'm the B student and things are going fairly well and the system seems to work for me and I'm progressing. And I could totally see how I could be in that bubble. I don't even condescend to people like that. Like, it's like you say, maybe at this point in their life, they're not ready or it's just not the thing for them to look into.
No, I think you're born with it. Like you said,
right.
I never had this, people often talk about this awakening moment or this moment where, they started to question the system. That never happened to me. I've questioned everything from the moment I could start reading,
Yes.
I remember as a little boy, looking at the pyramids and I was going, what?
Yes.
Questioning that, what they built.
I can tell you, mate, even though, again, it sounds ridiculous to say now when you're adult, I can tell you when I was a kid and they would be telling me religious ideas like, God, said that we have original sin. I was the little kid, literally, like the 5-year-old kid, like, but I didn't sin. Like, what? But not me, though. I'm good, right? I know what you mean. Like, you're either like that or you're not, I think. I agree.
That's interesting, that original sin thing, because obviously that comes from Christianity, who built this system of commerce. And what they're saying is, this is the merchants, this is what they've done. So you're born into sin. So when you're born a sinner and you have to pay that debt.
Yes.
Right? And you pay that debt with what? Your time. What's time? Time is your energy, and energy is, it becomes money. So that's what the system is based on, sin. So you're paying a debt, and they in some way view themselves as this, the right hand of God, collecting that debt for God. You see, that's what is the spiritual part to all this.
It's like you said earlier, that's why it's the notion of your birth certificate and that you don't know that you've already started essentially a corporate entity that you're working on behalf of that's part of this system.
Yeah, you're paying the debt.
Yes.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
By the way, one thing you touched on earlier that I think would be cool to expand a little bit on, because again, it'll take people's... The problem is, I always find the easiest way to explain the mercantile stuff is things like the British Empire or the Italian city-states. But then the problem becomes it's too abstract to today, so people can't connect it. So I see what you did there. You actually do always need to connect it to America, in my opinion, because people understand the idea that America's the world hegemon. So I have a quick thing I want to run by you, which is... I saw you reference something like this, so you must have looked into the same topic. When Americans, again, just think of how Twitter works, mate. Americans online talking shit, classic, by the way. We all have our own version of talking shit in the Anglosphere. It's all good. But the classic American chauvinistic ways to be like, you Brits, you're bloody still thinking about that Revolutionary War when we handed you your ass. And I always used to think when I was a boy, something's off about this, though, because wait a minute, how can you tell me? Because I always think the way Americans fall down, mate, is this. They think of current America And they put that, they retcon that back, and they think that's what America always was. So I always tell people, the Revolutionary War was a world empire pitted against one of its colonies, like the 13 colonies or whatever it was, which if you ever look, by the way, is a tiny strip on the east coast of America at the time. Yeah. And I always tell people, like, you didn't really win that war as much as the other side just sort of said, I'm not going to keep fighting this. Like, it's not like you beat the British Empire and then you became the British Empire that day and you suddenly were ruling in London and that was your cut. No, all you did is you essentially got them to say, all right, we're going to stop now. And if people don't look into this, I saw you were hinting at this. If people don't know, one of the weirdest things is you can actually just track all the documents for this. As soon as the official Revolutionary War ends, almost immediately, as far as I can tell, they describe it like this, mate. But again, if you just listen to how they're saying it, it tells you everything. They say, well, actually, a little interesting detail is, at the end, the English surrendered, but then just agreed to terms where they would have access to the American market. Mate, if you think of what we were just talking about earlier, that is the power structure. The power structure is you have the companies that operate in the markets. It's not really who has like the president title or the prime minister title, right? It's kind of right there when you look at it like that.
It's funny. I've got an article on that called Britain Regains America. So a few years after the war ended, I think it was a year or two, the first Bank of America is established. And guess who owned most of the shares in that bank?
The Crown or something.
Yeah, exactly. So, So, I mean, I believe that war was a war. It was a civil war between two factions of the British aristocracy.
Yes.
So it was basically the monarch and the crown on one side, and the royalists and the merchants of the city of London on the other. And they just wanted they were fighting over control of those territories.
It's actually why you might have heard people often reference that you can actually see parallels in the American, both the Revolutionary War and their Civil War, and like the English Civil War. If you look at like the divide, that's quite similar. It's similar, almost the same people on each side, right?
Yeah, they're just fighting over trade, who controls the trade and the money, and that's it. And the people at the top don't change; they're still the ones in control. That's it. That's all they're fighting for. It's the same throughout history, and I found it's the same with the Crusades as well. People think that was a war about religion. It had nothing to do with religion. It was about the Italian maritime republics fighting over commerce and trade in the East. Sure. That's all that. The more you look at the history, it's all, this is why I follow merchants.
Yes.
If you want to understand history, just follow the money, Just sit. Follow who's building, commercial centres where, who's building ports.
Well, mate, when you're talking about this topic, like obviously a classic one, but again, fiction's made people have ridiculous ideas about these people. If you ever ask someone who was involved in the Crusades, they'll tell you the Templars. Mate, that's all of banking. That's fucking banking right there.
Okay. I've just written an article on that as well, right? So what I found was 90% of the people that made up the Templar order weren't knights; they were accountants.
Wow,
90%. Okay, nice. So if you're a soldier or a Christian military order, what the hell does that got to do with banking?
Okay,
all right. So to me, these people are bankers, and they're bankers for the maritime republics, which are, another name for them is merchant republics. Okay, that's what they're known as well, merchant republics. So the Templars and these other orders were just what they were the security forces for the bankers. Right. So if you've got a lot of wealth to distribute and money to bring around, you need security, right? You need bodyguards. So that's what these knights were. They were the bodyguards. And and it's the same in the Vatican today. That's why you have those, what do you call them, the Swiss guards.
Oh, sure.
So, yeah.
By the way, one thing I don't want to ask though, one thing I'll say at the outset as a disclaimer to this question is this. I don't actually expect people, again, to always say like, the quiet part out loud. You can just hint at something if you don't want to go too explicit. But I want to ask it more clearly, which is, you keep hinting in your work at like a spiritual dimension, but then you also at times do reduce it down to material things that exist in the world and concepts people understand. since you have presented religion, I mean, that word itself even as a control system, behind religion, here's the quick tangent that'll explain this. I actually do think, like I said, about understanding that I'm not just an individual, I'm part of a bigger process. Essentially, what I learned is that the reason those aren't social constructs, that it's the other way around. They're actually ways of describing processes that exist. In the same way as here's the metaphor. If someone gets a dog, right, in theory, you are a human and there's one dog, right? The dog doesn't see it that way. The dog still thinks it's part of a dog pack, and it's either the leader of the pack and you're like the one below it, or you're the leader. That's how it works for each and a dog, right? Well, essentially, what you get there is the dog is running an operating system where it isn't an individual. It's part of a bigger group. So similarly, that's the way I've tried to look at the world. And when I see things like religion, I don't think they're purely artificial. To me, they're almost a way of laying a bunch of themes over the top of something that actually already exists, whether it's in the human mind or in some spiritual dimension, and you're sort of tapping into that. So essentially, my question would be, outside of like, if I say, is there a God? I don't mean, is it Jehovah? Is it Allah? Is it, I mean, is there some sort of a force or some sort of a spiritual force for, I don't know, goodness, creation in the world that these things are describing? What's your take?
Okay.
It's a massive question, obviously. It's an absurd question, but go for it. Give me your take.
I've been fortunate by having people around me that have experienced something, and these are people who are not religious, okay? And some of them have had backgrounds where they've been atheists, right? And they've had an experience which made them believe in something that, we would term God, okay? But the way they describe it is not like what we've come to understand, like you said, Yahweh and that. They view it like, for a better term, infinite love, okay? And you're in this kind of presence of something, and all you feel is now, this isn't my experience. This is an experience that people have had that I know of, and it's sort of like pure love. And but the thing is to attain that, to come to face to have this experience, you're almost given a test. And the test is, are you prepared to sacrifice everything? Or are you prepared to sacrifice the thing that is the most important to you? Okay? And that's the only way you can attain it, according to these people, okay? Now, all the doctrines, the religious doctrines, have this in them, okay? But they're not taught that way, okay? Because I believe, like, even the Bible and all these other books, they're an instruction manual on how to communicate with God directly between you and God. And God can be another way they describe it is like electricity or light. Okay, so it's not a figure, it's not a person. Okay, it's this energy. Okay, that surrounds you. I'm probably doing a terrible job of describing it. It's like, but this energy is like love. And when you come face to face with this energy, all time stands still. There's no time doesn't exist. That's another construct, of ours. Time, the merchants created time because they needed to measure our energy, to measure that to make it into money. So, God doesn't understand time. There's no time. I don't know. I haven't experienced that, but I would like to, and I believe it does exist. Okay. Something like that does exist because, from very early on, humans have spoken about it or tried to describe something like that, and that's where all the doctrines come from. Yes. And so there's something there, There's definitely something there.
But here's where I can tell you from my own side. I don't go super deep into this on my channel, understandably. It's a very personal thing. But I have had experiences like what you're describing. I mean, some of them were just literally like classic psychedelic drug experiences where I had a sense of something external to myself communicating with me, etc. Although I certainly see there's flaws in that area. I don't promote that lifestyle, I have to say. But I will say even other things, like simple things like meditation and concepts like that, I would say from these experiences, I actually get what you're talking about now, because essentially I would describe it the same way, which is the mistake before was I was thinking from like a very rationalistic right brain this is like the fucking, everything has to make logical sense. That was the ultimate truth to me. And so in that scenario, it's very easy to be atheistic because obviously you can just pick holes in a story, or you can say,
that's right.
How could this be totally true? Whereas essentially to me, this will sound, full enough, if you're in the atheistic worldview, like a bunch of bollocks, like I've just tricked myself. But I would say, I actually feel like this is almost like a synthesis of these ideas. And I feel like I've transcended it, because essentially the mistake I learned was, I don't actually think God or the religious dimension or the spiritual dimension, whatever you want to say, I don't think it even operates on the same plane as the material and things like logic and reason. So to me, you're getting lost if you think you're going to somehow prove it's right, or you're going to find the evidence. Like, it's not that you're tricking yourself and believing things that aren't true, like one of those classic like Voltaire type quotes. It's more that like it's a different way of thinking about everything. And I would actually agree, which is like one of the things I often say about the Bible is, almost certainly if you look at the way the Bible's been translated and written, people have fucked with it and tried to make things look a certain way. But it feels to me like in that book and a number of other traditions, there's almost like a universal truth that they can't totally dilute. They can put a bunch of signal noise in, and they can trick you and say, they can essentially, by the way, one of the best tricks they ever use, you'll notice, is they tell you how to think about what you're reading. It's almost like they make the Cliff's Notes version of every book, and you don't ever just read the book yourself and experience it. You just read it with them going, and of course what the author meant by that was this, and what he's really saying is that, and in doing so you never ask those questions yourself. And so to me, when you strip away all the things that are social control and brainwash, at the core, even things like the Bible, almost certainly to me have like a universal wisdom to them, mate. Like actually do. They resonate with me, No,
and meditation, I didn't mention it earlier, but that is the way to communicate, apparently. That's the way to communicate with God.
When you were saying earlier, mate, that the Bible is a guide, I would tell you the most basic guide of the Bible to contact God, like you're saying, it literally, think about what they say. It's things like quiet your mind, remove distractions, don't think of base worldly things, allow yourself the space and the time, and sometimes, like you said, the silence and the isolation to actually potentially connect to. Think of it like a radio. If you were in a busy area with a million signals all going on top of each other, you're never going to get to the source, as it were, in the Matrix analogy,
Yeah, and going back to what you said about drugs as well, and I've known of people having similar experiences through using drugs. One of them ended up in a mental asylum for 10 years, and another one just completely lost the plot. I would say there's a lot of casualties, mate. I often give this analogy on this channel that it's like being someone, if you think of a normie as your grandma using a Windows PC, this shit's like trying to hack the BIOS and start coding it yourself. It's like, look, if you were an amazing programmer, that'd be better, but you could see how someone could fuck their whole life up doing that. Did you know that? What you're trying to do, you're trying to trick, you're trying to find a back door into God.
Yeah, essentially.
So what you're doing is, you're not ready. It's God telling you you're not ready. So you're trying to fast track it, and
they're trying to hack you into heaven.
You're not ready, and it's telling you, So it's got to happen naturally. You need to be ready, and the way to do it is, like you said, through meditation. This is what I'm told. Through meditation, and there's a good YouTuber called Bill Donahue, and he dissects the Bible and breaks it down, and he says it's all taken from the Avesta, which was the doctrine of Zoroaster.
By the way, I'm sure people who've done a little bit of conspiracy research will get this. There's obviously loads of astrology in the Bible, mate. It's fucking tons of it,
Fuck yeah.
Loads of those stories and parables are just outlining these concepts.
That's another thing. Christianity, I believe, when the Bible was first launched, you weren't allowed to read it, right?
Sure.
No one was able to have access to it. And that only happened after the Protestant Reformation. I think originally they wanted someone to guide you through it so you could understand what they were trying to say. Okay? But now everyone reads it and they've got their own crazy interpretations of what's going on in there. So I just wanted to say I don't believe it was its initial intention.
Okay.
What it's become, and it was meant to be a guide, like I mentioned, to meditate on what was being said there, and to try and reach what we we perceive as being God, or that reality. Yeah.
By the way, when you mentioned the idea that when they tell you about the world, one of the core concepts that they bake into everything is the idea of time as this linear process that's ever marching on. I would even say they socially and politically always do this in the notion of progress, because you notice what people miss about the word progress is they think it means it's always getting better. And that if you follow what they say is progress, that's like the right way, and we're all, the light's getting brighter and all these metaphors. Whereas what I would say is I actually agree with you. I know what people mean when they say time isn't real. Like, put it this way, have you ever noticed how, and this totally comes from fiction, mate, because obviously every story ends. Every story has to have a point where it no longer continues, and where the arc of the narrative completes itself or ends at that point in time. And what I would say is that doesn't seem at all like the world we live in. The world we live in seems like cycles, yeah, certainly. But you notice they're not cycles like 7 days a week, for example, the ones they give us. They're things like crop cycles and solar cycles and electric cycles, maybe even cycles of thought. But more importantly to me, that idea of this like permanent momentum or inertia of history, that seems completely fake, mate. Because notice how that is always baked into every conspiracy theory. It's the idea, it's a biblical idea that like the end times are here. You better do things quickly because it's almost over. Almost like, it's almost like they've 99% completed the bomb exploding in the movie, as it were. The timer's on, well, by then now they'll say the timer's on the number 1 and you've got to get there before it explodes. Whereas I don't really see the world like that, mate. I feel like you have these waves of things coming in and coming out, and things are more restrictive at times, and maybe the population dies off, and then there's other times when it booms. And I know what you mean. That idea of like this one-pointed direction of history does seem fake. Because it seems like it's very useful to push people one way or another. I mean, think of things like COVID or the stock market or Bitcoin or something. They're always about like where it's going tomorrow and how much time is there left, and you've got to act now. There's an urgency that adds to it,
Exactly. One of their mechanisms is fear. So anything that makes you fearful is coming from them. It's their manipulation at work. That's the way I view it. Anyway.
Oh, that's a good lens. Yeah.
Yeah. So if you're feeling fearful of something, then that's them. That's not,
By the way, that's another thing I often tell people on these side channel interviews. I often say exactly what you just said, which is if you go and study a bunch of conspiracy stuff and you come away feeling really paranoid and attacked and scared, then that was like laced shit, mate. You got the bad batch. Like, I actually find when you learn like things that seem like they're true or have like a higher reality, it's freeing, mate. I find it actually takes away anxiety. Yeah. Like, for example, I'm actually one of the few people, mate, without going deep, you notice I don't say those words, but it's weird, during the whole COVID period, I wasn't actually particularly fearful, unlike a lot of people, mate, even though you would think even though I'm in a similar boat to you, I should, by their logic, have been the most afraid that I'm going to die. I never had that. Similar with things like, again, I won't go into these tangents, but I don't sit around, mate, and worry about them telling me the nuclear clock's at 11:59 p.m. and stuff. Again, these things to me are such obvious constructs to create, like you say, to create the fear feeling. That's the function. It's not a byproduct.
No, and it's not the natural state either.
Yes.
That's why you can tell it's manufactured. Yeah, and I was the same as you. I wasn't fearful through that period. I wasn't even surprised by people's reaction, because I knew that was the reaction that most people would take. The that kind of paranoid. Oh, you're not vaccinated. Oh my God,
Right.
That.
Right.
I don't know if you experienced that, but I did. I
did, but here's the thing. Maybe I'm naive. I actually thought I was a fairly cynical, paranoid person before COVID. But believe it or not, I was kind of shocked by the scale they were able to pull it off on, though, mate. That's the problem. Like, I thought you'd get... Here's the thing, again. I think I just took too many people at face value that they do, want to know the truth. And, I just want to know what's happening, man. And there should be transparency. I believed all that. What I didn't realise was a lot of that was just like how they wanted to be perceived by other people. Actually, you know what? Some of it's not even other people. Some of it's how you think about yourself. When you say shit like that out loud, like all I care about's the truth, some of that's almost an affirmation of who you want to believe you are as a person. But the question there isn't like, is that the case? Like, the question is, when you are confronted with the difficult truth that is not what you want to know, do you still embrace it? If you don't, then you never really did care about truth as it was anyway. You just wanted things that sort of made you feel good, right?
Oh, people want to validate their beliefs at the end of the day. There's so many people online that I get really frustrated with, and I don't engage them because it's just, they talk about truth and how truth is important. But then, if you question one of their beliefs, it's like, And, religion is a big one.
Of course.
Far
or
out.
whatever political figure they're into. Yeah. By the way, that in itself ties into what I said earlier. I genuinely do think, this is why I think on some level all humans do need some sort of a spiritual path. Because I do think if you don't do a spiritual path, you will just make being Republican your spiritual path. Donald Trump will become your Pope. You know what I mean? Like, you just go down, the founding fathers become your saints. Like, you know what I said earlier? To me, there's some sort of a technology invisible to us in the mind or the world, and we're taking concepts and sort of laying them thematically over it, and then thinking like, because we made the theme up, that we made the whole thing up. It's why I told you, I don't think that, when people say that thing, it's a social construct. It's like, some of these things are incredibly fundamental. They're not constructed, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, I know, but this is what's happened. If people don't want to use your brain, they'll create something for you to believe in. So if you don't want to use, your own mind, they'll create a mind for you to, they'll create a program for your mind to follow.
Right.
So that's what's happened, and that's why it doesn't work on everyone, but it works on like 90% of the people.
Yeah.
And
oh, by the way, that's why that whole awakening thing doesn't vibe with me either, mate.
No,
when people go, "Hey, everyone's waking up," and then I look around and it's like 99% of people are eating all the current propaganda. Yeah, they're loving it.
Yeah. Asleep and awake is where you go when after someone dies. Awake.
True.
So that's another one. Yeah, I'm awake, but then, like I said, you press their belief systems and you find they're not. And that's another thing with this experience that people have told me about that I mentioned earlier is you can't go there with any beliefs. They're like this, you got to leave all that behind. Leave everything,
Well, put it this way, mate. Here's another statement that might sound like a black pill if someone hasn't gone down this path, but actually, to me, it's a white pill, which is that almost everything that you thought and were told by the external system is fake on some level.
I've heard that before too, yeah.
Don't you think so? Yeah. I mean, you know what I mean? Like, put it this way, your Substack shows this. Another classic trap is to think, oh, this is just some recent shit. That's why people go, it's when they came off the gold standard, or, it's just, it's Trump and that. It's like, no, mate, if anything, it's the other way around. When you apply the methods of discovery that you've done to modern psyops, like you say, mate, it goes back centuries, sometimes thousands of years. Some of these ideas go back and you can pick, by the way, history's my favorite one. If you, in the same way as it's very easy for people in the media landscape now to pick apart fake news stories, mate, the amount of history that's fake is unbelievable.
I mean, that's been one of my surprises.
Yeah, it's nuts, isn't it? It never ends. The rabbit hole never ends.
It's nothing new, like you said, nothing new. I mean, Plato's cave analogy. I mean, they knew back then. They're telling you exactly the same thing that your people. Conspiracy theorists are coming up with today.
Yes.
They were writing about it in ancient Greece. It's just nothing new, absolutely nothing. Because at the end of the day, what are we? We're the same. We're humans. So we operate in the same way. We haven't changed the way we operate. It's just the program that changes.
Yes.
Yeah.
By the way, I thought one last topic we could do was the appropriate place to wrap it, because I actually said, like before, I actually also don't want to sort of build these fear booby traps into this sort of thinking and make it sound like doom and gloom. So one thing I would ask you, and this is another reason I was very interested in your work actually, is yours doesn't seem like it's tainted with that paranoia, though, that does seem to infect people who are in conspiracy thinking. And so one thing I would ask you is this. People often wonder why I always say on this channel that I don't try to I don't do a breakdown of a whole topic in depth, because my whole thing is like, if I find something interesting, like I said earlier, I don't think everyone's into those topics. I don't think everyone wants to be free or thinking. So what I try to do is I do what in this analogy, the Illuminati's do, and I drop a breadcrumb, I sort of hint at it, and it's up to that person to take that and go and check out a source or read a book, and they have to do the legwork themselves. So I would ask you this. How have you been able to explore these topics? You've done a very good job, like I said, with your Substack and this book as a primer. But I notice that a trap as well is that these rabbit holes really do never end. I even think that's a function of them too. That essentially there's unlimited material. The joke is that it is the truth that the world's more like Brave New World than 1984. They don't delete all the books. They just flood the market with infinity books and infinity shit. And especially shit versions of those books that are watered down so that you can just never get to the original book, which, as we're talking about, might be some weird book from 1895 by some guy in like America or something who's into spiritualism or something crazy. So what I would ask is, how do you explore these topics? Because it feels like you're able to do something I've been able to do, but I imagine I have a different path. I always say I'm able to go down the rabbit hole, look at it, but then I always remember that I have to come out of the rabbit hole and be a normal person again, and I have to not go and talk to all my family. I've got to in some ways almost have a double life, but they're both real. You know what I mean? So how do you manage that? Because it seems like I don't get that kind of a sensationalist vibe from you, or a fear aspect. So how are you able to explore all this stuff, but then also kind of be grounded? How do you do it?
Well, it's because I've made it part of my life, and I don't speak about this stuff with, obviously everybody, because like you said, it turns people off. And, but I don't know, I grew up in a family that we could discuss these things. It was never, taboo, these subjects. Right. Well, we could just speak about anything. We could just speak our mind, it wasn't an issue. And also it's important that your partner has the same kind of mindset, I guess, or is open to these things. So that helps as well. Okay. So you can imagine, our household, our discussions at the dinner table are quite open. We just talk about all this kind of stuff with the children that are absorbing it all. I don't know what's going to happen.
You're really coming out like, oh, hey, honey, I just found out that the Phoenicians did this with a gift. Oh, right, okay, that's cool.
We do,
okay.
We do. Oh, did you know this and that?
Right.
And it's like, in ancient Egypt there was this, and did you know this word means this? And that's our normal conversation around the house. But I don't know. I've never been someone to live in fear, I guess. Maybe because I experienced death early on. Like my mother died when I was quite young. I would say that probably played a part in it. So when you're confronted with death, if your mother dies when you're quite young, it sort of makes you a little bit like invincible. Nothing's really going to hurt you after that. Right. Do you know what I mean?
So, I have to say, obviously, people can go different ways. But if you saw that in fiction, they would always present it as, that'd be the trauma that haunted you your whole life.
You need trauma.
It seems like you've had the opposite. Like it's been able to give you almost like an acceptance of reality.
Yeah. And also that brings me on to the other point about the experiences people had with, facing God. They've had to have some kind of trauma in there. They've all had some trauma in their life. Okay, so, and that kind of trauma is what drives them to reach this state almost. So, so the trauma plays a big role, a big part in it as well. So I don't know. I've always, I'm not always, positive about things. So, I'm not going to lie. I mean, I have my moments as well, but I just don't think people are out to get me. I don't think the system is out to get me.
Oh, by the way, that's something else that maybe you could speak to, which is, I said way back at the beginning that when I look at the world, whatever technology runs in the world seems like it's consent-based. I know what you mean, mate. I often tell people this analogy too on this channel. It's a famous one people have heard, which goes, it's actually not true that they completely censor every true idea like this. One of the things they do that's very clever is, I said earlier, I try not to say the quiet part out loud. It's like if you say it's almost like internet search. If you say certain keywords, then the agents of the Matrix will hunt you down and fuck with you. But if you can sort of abstractly present some of these ideas, or you do it like you do in a way that doesn't have like a political agenda, you're not trying to get people to join a movement, you're not trying to tell people to boycott the taxation or something. As long as you don't do some of those things, my analogy I give is, in some ways, society, mainstream society, is like being, my analogy is, it's like being in a bar that everyone knows is run by the mafia. You're allowed to go into the bar and have a drink and talk to people who were there, but you can't go into the bar and start screaming, it's run by the mafia, everyone, stop, they're all going to fucking... If you do that, the goons will come and kick you out. You know what I mean? Because I know
that's perfect.
You're able to say all these things on Substack and Twitter, but I don't feel like people come and clamp you down. You're allowed to say your things.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I mentioned particular names, especially, names of people who are present at this time. So, I'm not pointing the finger at anyone in particular. And the other thing is that I don't think we can change the system. That the system will change when it's ready, when the people who are behind it will change it. We're almost like observers, so. That's my approach. So I'm not gonna kill myself trying to change it. It's just gonna happen when it happens, and you can partake in it when you want or when you don't. It's exactly like COVID. I didn't partake in that, right?
Yes.
And I didn't. I wasn't punished for it. I didn't lose anything. True. I didn't. So I wasn't. So it's like you said. If the mafia comes along, they're going to offer you, you want to join the mafia? You can say yes or no. No, I don't want to. So, that's my approach. So, yeah, that's why I've been able to sort of not be affected by it, I guess, as some people are. Yeah.
Because let's make this the last point. I actually thought one of the best quotes that you put in that document was the one by Euripides, which, by the way, I already love because I always tell people, a bit like what you said earlier, one of the coolest things, actually, I find, is the reason why I know this notion of the relentless march of progress and people getting more advanced and evolved is nonsense, is when you go and read ancient texts. Like if you go and read ancient Greek, or I often say, actually, if you get into the Christian tradition, go and read people like St. Augustine. Like, mate, these guys already went through most of the interesting intellectual discussions, but thousands of years ago, and they already got to more advanced positions than current thinking, etc. So you have a quote there by Euripides that says, "A slave is he who cannot speak his thoughts." And I thought the last thing we could reference is what we were just talking about here, which is I do think if you go online and you start essentially in a fever pitch saying COVID, certain names of politicians, certain names of movement. If you do all that and you put a load of symbols on, that's why I call them cursed terms, mate. I think those are loaded up with almost like a psychic energy and they attract negative forces or people who are control systems. Whereas I think anything can be said. It's how you say it if we go back to that topic. I think you can actually always express truth, but I think you have to do it through either metaphor and fiction, or you do it through what was the term? Or you do it through abstraction. Like I say, you notice how I try not to say the name. I'll just describe the process of it. I feel like if you do that, you can say anything, mate. I mean, I think you do say everything.
I've never refrained from saying anything. I think I've always spoken my mind. I just don't. The reason I don't point to individuals is because I don't think they're really in control of it. So so what is the purpose of me, calling this person out when I don't think they're really, the person in power, Yes. So even though the politicians, were promoting these kind of, again, using COVID, these policies and these vaccines, really, were they the ones making those decisions? I don't believe so.
No.
So what is the point, throwing them under the bus, So that's why I don't do that. I see the bigger picture in it.
I thought what we could end on is, normally I don't do the whole podcast. Hey, what do you got coming up? Are you going to need tour gigs? But along those lines, I do have a question for you, which is, since I myself want to actually now check out your Substack, if people were going to become a subscriber, first of all, I will say you've done a great job already because you've got loads of pieces on there, which is really great value 50, when they sign up. Yeah. But I would ask this, almost not quite an advert, but if you had to give people a concept of what will the Substack be in the future, what sorts of topics will you explore? Do you have a vision for it?
Oh no! I only plan one article
right.
in your head. I mean, I don't know what.
It seems like you've got a very broad set of interests, though. You're willing to follow this thing everywhere
because it's all connected.
Right.
See, it's all connected, and I never envisioned that it would, I would have 50 articles after a year and a half. I was just trying to, like I said, get behind the language, first of all, trying to understand who wrote it, why, and then it leads to so many other things. It led to maritime law, and then it led to, Christianity, the Bible, merchants, the Phoenicians, the maritime republics, and then, the corporations. And it's the story that keeps on giving. So yes. I don't think I'm going to run out of any topics anytime soon. Let's put it that way. So yeah, I don't have a plan for it. Actually, I do wish that I could do it full time because I'm not doing this full time.
Oh, okay.
So it's I don't have any free time at all. I mean, I used to be a gamer. Forget that. I haven't played a game in over a year.
Right.
So because I'm trying to juggle my paying job.
Sure.
And growing this Substack, which, I hope to, earn, a full-time income from eventually. So that's my aim. Yeah.
Without the noble families of the Italian city-states, you may never have heard of or been able to appreciate the art of some of the greatest Renaissance artists of all time. And similarly, my content on this channel, which I consider art, is kindly supported by irradiation, and the rest of my Patreon supporters. Do you want to choose one of the topics that I might focus on next in a video? Maybe you want to ask me a question that I'll answer in a video AMA. Do you want teasers? Find out who the upcoming guests are for Thorinquiry. Maybe you want to take part in one of those private, never to be released, recorded for your benefit discussions with me one-on-one, where you can talk about almost any topic, assuming it's appropriate. Well, if any of those perks or others tickle your fancy, heed this call to action and join Thorin's side today at the Patreon link in the description box below.